It's crazy to think that these Iceberg videos have been coming out for almost a year now. We all thought this was like a passing fad on YouTube, but no, people still are making more of these Iceberg videos on subjects you'd never expect. I love these videos so much, and I've always wanted to make one, but I feel like there wasn't anything I was knowledgeable enough in to warrant creating an Iceberg video, and the stuff that I was very knowledgeable about has already been taken. But then this happened.
Oh my gosh! Oh, yeah! Oh my goodness! What? Oh, it's Shred, they're doing it! Shred! Yes! Yes! Woo!
And all of a sudden, I'm obsessed with Metroid all over again. I started playing the games again. I was rereading the manga, and I was just devouring any video content I could find on it, whether it be trivia, lore, or gameplay, or anything really. During my ravenous search for Metroid content, I realized that there is no Metroid Iceberg video. I'm crazy, right? You'd think Metroid, one of the most influential and iconic video game franchises of all time, would have an Iceberg video by now. There's certainly enough content for it, like both for the games and the crazy lore it has, and yet somehow this freaking Sims got an Iceberg video first. The Sims! How? In fact, there hasn't even been any Iceberg images. The first one to be made was back in May by a Reddit user named Nip Coyote, and then a month later, another one was made by Super Red Plays, and yet still a video hadn't been made at that point. So regardless, my chance had finally come. I took Nep Coyotes and Super Red Plays Iceberg, smashed them together, and created this. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, I present to you the most comprehensive Metroid Iceberg image that could possibly be available on the internet, complete with custom artwork made by me, and we are going to break down this monster layer by layer. As you can see, there is a lot we gotta go through, and this intro is already starting to get lengthy, so let's just go! Justin Bailey. So, the very first Metroid game on the Nintendo Entertainment System used a password system. Although it's worth noting that this was only the case for the Western release on the game. This is because in Japan, Metroid actually released on the Famicom Disk System, and the disc had enough storage space to have save slots in it, whereas on the West, it was released on cartridges, which didn't have battery saves in it, so that's why a password was used instead. But this password system was also a way to input cheat codes, and the most famous of which was Justin Bailey, which basically gave you a version of Samus in which she wears nothing but a purple leotard, and yet is somehow maxed out with her ammo and her energy tanks, and has almost all of her weapons. There's been a lot of debate over the years as to what Justin Bailey actually means. Two of the most popular theories are that it's a name, because Justin and Bailey's the last name. The second is that it's referring to a bathing suit, because it's actually just in Bailey, and Bailey is a slang term for a bathing suit referring to the fact that Samus is in a onesie. So these sound like they make sense enough, which is why they're the most accepted theories. The problem is they're both a crock of lies. There has never been any point in time in history where Bailey has been a slang term for a bathing suit, and there is no one by the name of Justin Bailey in the credits of Metroid, either in the Japanese team or the English localization team. So what the hell does this mean? Like, the whole Justin Bailey theory was just something that someone pulled out of their ass, and people just ran with it because that was one of the first explanations they heard, and it's also been the explanation that's been peddled through like various magazines and online sources and stuff. So if neither of these things are true, then what the hell does Justin Bailey even mean then? Well, as it turns out, the Metroid database ran a password generator through the ROM of the game and found that there's actually multiple different passwords that can trigger this same cheat code, including variants of the name Justin Bailey. So what the hell does all this mean? In my original upload, I basically concluded that there was no conclusive answer to why Justin Bailey is the way it is. But after stumbling into some more information, I think I actually can provide an answer. So the way that NES passwords worked back in the day is that every single character is actually a line of code that's changing the values in the game's programming itself. So by typing in passwords, you are actually in a sense reprogramming the game itself. The reason why multiple different passwords can create the Justin Bailey effect is because putting Samus in a leotard is actually a condition that one of the characters is activating, because as it turns out, putting her in a leotard is actually a post-game reward if you're able to complete the game in underneath an hour. It's basically an unlockable mode, and the cheat code basically allows you to activate that state without the work. And furthermore, her hair color isn't actually supposed to be green. Her hair color is actually indicating what type of suit power-up she has while in the leotard. If she's in the default mode, her hair is brunette. If she has the various suit, her hair becomes blonde. And if she has the gravity suit, it's green. The truth is probably that someone was just dicking around with the password system and found that their name, or maybe the name of someone they knew, just happened to work and gave you the super badass cheat code sequence. And as stated earlier, Justin Bailey was one of the first passwords to get reported on, and everyone's just been peddling Varia suit. Some people also pronounce it as Varia suit, including me for the longest time, but I choose to now call it the Varia suit because of the name's origins. In Japanese, this power-up is actually called the barrier suit, but when it was translated into English, it was misspelled and mistranslated, so it became Varia suit, which I think is much better. It sounds more unique and more alien, appropriate for the game's theming. In the original NES game, it was just a color swap, but in the sequel, Metroid 2 Return of Samus was on the Game Boy, which didn't support color at the time. So in order to distinguish it from your previous older armor, it was redesigned to have these giant 90s shoulder pads on it to make it visually distinct, and they just stuck around and just become super iconic to Samus's image. In most of her appearances, she's actually wearing the Varia suit instead of her default normal suit. Ridley Scott. It's likely that one of the recurring antagonists of the series, Ridley, borrows his name from acclaimed film director Ridley Scott. One of his most notable achievements is directing the Alien franchise. And speaking of which, Alien inspired Metroid. It's been confirmed in an interview with the Metroid co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto that the Alien franchise did in fact play a huge influential role in the game's developmental history. Back when they were making the very first game on NES, he took his team and pointed them towards the first film in the series as inspiration as the kind of mood and setting they need to create in the game. However, there's a chance that it extended beyond that first movie though, since there's a lot of interesting parallels between the Metroid and the Alien franchises in terms of their stories. For example, both of them star a strong female character who has to survive on her own, and usually ends each movie in her underwear. The second game in the series, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, has her going to the Metroid homeworld to exterminate their queen. Kinda like how Ripley's been sent to the Xenomorph homeworld with a ragtag team with the intent of destroying the alien Xenomorph queen. In the third game of the series, Super Metroid, the last surviving Metroid has created a bond with Samus because she spared it at the end of the last game. Kinda like how in Alien 3, there's this half-human, half-xenomorph that forms a bond with Ripley. And finally, in the fourth entry in Metroid, it has Samus being infused with Metroid DNA. Kind of like how in the Alien Resurrection, it stars a clone of Ripley who has xenomorph DNA in her, because in one of the older movies, a queen was growing inside of her because of reasons. And they were trying to use her to manufacture more xenomorphs to use as bioweapons. I haven't seen Prometheus myself, so if anyone that has, please leave in the comments if you think there's any interesting parallels so far to Dread. Speaking of Metroid Dread, at this point it's pretty well documented, and there's already plenty of videos out there describing how the latest entry in the series, Metroid Dread, has been in development for almost 20 years. The specifics as to how it's been cancelled and then restarted and cancelled again, it's a very complicated story, and there's other videos out there that have already described this journey much better than I could in a short span. So I'm just going to link one of them in the description. To give the TLDR for those who don't even know, we first heard about a new 2D Metroid game back in 2005 when IGN released some articles saying how Nintendo had a new 2.5D Metroid in the works for the then upcoming Nintendo DS. Guys, let me tell you, to really push the fact how long it's been since that time, I remember reading those articles in 2005. And you wanna know what has happened since then? I went through middle school. I went through high school. I went through college. I've gone through 5 different jobs, 4 separate girlfriends, married the latest one, and now my firstborn child is on the way and is probably going to drop around the same time as this game's coming out. It's been literally an entire generation since we heard about this game and it actually coming out. Let that sink in for a bit. AM2R. So again, this is another one of those things that have been well documented within the Metroid community, but for those who don't know, the first 2 Metroid games in the series didn't really age well to modern gaming standards, especially the second one, which existed on the Game Boy. And you know who else thought this? Yoshio Sakamoto. So that's why in 2004, he took the first game and completely remade it from the ground up for the Game Boy Advance to more resemble Super Metroid and the subsequent games afterwards. And it was a hoot! It was so good that fans were eager to see him give the same treatment to Metroid 2, but it just ended up never happening. In fact, we wouldn't have another 2D Metroid game for over 10 years. So with no official remake in sight, a lot of fans decided to take matters into their own hands and just make the game themselves. So in the late 2000s, there were dozens of fan projects that popped up that were attempting to give Metroid 2 the zero mission treatment. In fact, there were so many of these that when Dr. M64 started his version, he simply called it another Metroid 2 remake. But as it turns out, making games is hard, especially a game the size of Metroid, and you're trying to make all of that by yourself. So very quickly, most of these projects went abandoned, but not Dr. M's, whose real name is Milton, by the way. Over the course of 10 years, Milton was working on his remake on and off until finally, in 2017, he finished it and reached a fully playable build out in the wild, at the exact same time Nintendo was releasing their official Metroid 2 remake. Yeah, suffice to say, Nintendo did everything in their power to try and erase it from the internet, but by then it was too late. Links are still out there to download the game, so you're free to give it yourself a go. It is honestly impressive what one man was able to do, even if it did take him a really long time to do so. But again, making games is hard. I feel like not enough people understand this. In other brighter news, Milton was actually scooped up by Moon Studios as an official employee, and this was the same studio that created Ori and the Blind Forest, which is another Metroid-inspired game. Milton was in fact involved in its sequel, Ori and the Will of the Wisp. Metroid inspired an entire subgenre. Metroidvania is what happens when someone very clever on the internet noticed that Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which were games that released very close to each other, had a lot of similarities to each other, right down to the grid-based map that the two used. Both these games were unusual in that, unlike most platformers at the time, which were more obstacle course-centered challenges, these games had a much bigger emphasis on exploring a maze-like area, trying to find a whole bunch of keys, which also doubled as power-ups. And so someone on the internet thought they were being very clever when they decided to call this a new genre of action platformers and call them Metroidvanias. And now today, over half of the indie market is just nothing but Metroidvania games. It is kind of baffling to see how there's so many of these types of games, and a couple of them even went on to be semi-mainstream successes like Hollow Knight and the aforementioned Ori and the Blind Forest, that it took Nintendo this long to try and make another one. Although, there is something to be said about Metroid's overarching influence on indie games in general. Cave Story is often credited as the grandfather of the indie game movement. And do you want to know what was the main inspiration behind that game? Super Metroid? Yeah, Daisuke was a big fan of Metroid games, but his main criticism at the time was that Samus wasn't cute enough. Yes, really. So he decided to create his own version that did star a bunch of cute characters. And now we have the entire indie game movement. Ridley for Smash. So Ridley is the longest character request for the Smash Bros. Series ever. Long before Master Chief, long before Goku, way longer before Sans, people have been demanding Ridley to be in Smash Bros. And I think it all goes back to Super Smash Bros. Melee. When that game was first announced, they showed off this super nice looking FMV sequence, which ended up becoming the game's intro. It showed off every single playable character in that game, and gorgeous fidelity that's never been seen before up to that point. And everyone who appeared in that trailer made an appearance in Smash Bros. In one form or the other. And one of those characters was Ridley fighting off Samus, and it looked really cool. So I think that fired up people's imaginations and got them expecting Ridley to appear as a playable character. But lo and behold, when the game came out, he was nowhere to be found, except as a trophy. And thus began a nearly 20-year-long crusade of trying to get Ridley into Smash Bros. And every single time, Masahiro Sakurai said no. Enjoy Ridley as a boss character, because guess what? He is too big to fit as a character. Yeah, that was really his excuse. Mind you, Kirby is only supposed to be like the size of a beach volleyball, but that apparently didn't stop him. But you know what? 20 years of constant online harassment can change anyone's mind, so in 2018, the very first new character to be revealed for that game was Ridley. Just to shut people up, but shut them up it did. When he was revealed, the entire internet collectively creamed its pants.
Super Metroid invented speedrunning. No, that was wrong, that was wrong! In the original upload, I was insinuating that Super Metroid was single-handedly responsible for creating speedrunning as a thing in general, and that was just blatantly not true. Although the way the game was designed, it did encourage players to complete the game as fast as possible, which was unusual unless you were Sonic the Hedgehog or a racing game.
Every single Metroid game keeps track of your playtime, and at the end of your run, you get to see a new ending depending how fast your run is. And by ending, I just mean you get to see Samus in skimpier and skimpier outfits the faster your time is. Look, this may seem quaint back then, but at a time when porn took 20 minutes to download over the internet and was probably going to break your computer afterwards, someone nutted off to this.
So players were already primed to trying to complete this game as fast as possible, which is why the entire series as a whole would become a very prominent game to play in speedrunning circles. However, it did not in fact create speedrunning as we know it. That was actually because of Doom. The reason why speedrunning never really took off until Doom came about was because of the simple fact that there was no way to verify if someone was telling the truth or not. After all, the earliest held record for a speedrun in the Guinness Book of World Records turned out to be a big fat lie. So it wasn't until Doom's replay system came along and players could not only save and record their play sessions but also easily share them up through the internet, was speedrunning allowed to be a thing at all. Because now you have definitive proof that you were not a cheater. For the longest time, however, it was restricted only to Doom and its sister series Quake, because these were the only games that contained the replay feature at the time. But by 2001, internet speeds and download rates were tolerable enough where you could start uploading videos. So that's why on the website that was the biggest hotspot for Quake and Doom replays, the owner of the website decided to upload his own personal run of Metroid Prime, and after that, he just said, fuck it, this website is no longer just for Doom and Quake, it's now for any game, for anyone who can manage to get a video recording on. And that was how modern speedrunning came to be. While Super Metroid didn't invent speedrunning, Metroid as a franchise did end up playing a very critical role in bringing speedrunning to the forefront and allowing it to grow to what it is today.
Why can't Metroid crawl? So this was a point that I just got completely wrong when I made the first video. Originally I thought it was a meme that's been around for decades, and that just wasn't true at all. I guess at the time when it was prevalent, it was just peddled everywhere so often that it felt like it's been around for years, but in truth it was only around for a couple years during the heyday of the Wii U era. Around that time, Nintendo had its own social media platform called Miiverse. And yes, the very brand-friendly Nintendo trying to run its own social media platform went exactly as you expected. Honestly, I would highly recommend checking out Izia's video on Miiverse just to truly understand how chaotic and unhinged that platform was. It was an absolutely magical time. But for our purposes, we're just only going to talk about this one post that someone made in the Super Metroid community, which was them asking why Samus couldn't crawl underneath the very first little crevice that you find in the game. Now, look, this kid was probably like 12, and we all did stupid shit when we were kids, so I don't want to like really rail this kid for, you know, just being a kid. In their defense, this is some of the less stupid shit you'd see on Miiverse. This was only the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately. But yeah, the sheer audacity of this post caused this quote to go viral. As a result, there was a lot of debate over how useful the Morph Ball actually was as a power-up. And there were a whole bunch of theory videos either discrediting it or defending it. I think that's also why I got the idea that the quote was originally making fun of the Morph Ball, because suddenly its entire functionality had been called into question all because of like the stupid post. However, I will stand by my stance in the original video that the Morph Ball is actually an amazing power-up and a technological feat, because the armor is transforming its entire shape and still offering protection and increases your mobility while allowing you to fit yourself into smaller spaces. That is something we are not inventing for at least another few hundred years. At least not with conventional technology.
Okay, I actually had a lot more to say about this later than I thought I would, and we haven't even scratched the surface yet. The Metroid manga. In 2003, to try and promote the release of Metroid Zero Mission, Nintendo commissioned a 2-volume manga that basically served as an origin story for Samus. And I gotta say, guys, I don't normally read manga, and I'm pretty sure that's been made obvious how I pronounce it.
Manga?
Yes, so I've heard. But I gotta say, this is one of my favorite reads of all time. This is a story that humanizes Samus in a way we've never seen in any of the games, but yet it also doesn't completely butcher her character the same way that certain official titles ended up doing. We get to see Samus as a total badass, but we also get to see a lot of like her more tender and caring side that we normally don't get to see outside of Metroid 2. And yet at the same time, we also see her at her most vulnerable that we've ever seen in any of the games. But it's not offensive and it's not insulting, because it treats PTSD very realistically and with a lot of like care and tact. And furthermore, you buy all of this because most of the story takes place when Samus was still really young and never really had the chance to confront and sort out the traumatic events of her past. So if anything, this actually like does so much to like sympathize her, and the fact that you witness her like grow beyond like her struggles and it strengthens her resolve to like protect the galaxy. It really drives home like why Samus is not only like one of my favorite female heroines of all time, but she's just one of my favorite characters, period. And plus, like, the artwork is just really badass, man. Like, there's some surprisingly gruesome stuff that happens in this for a comic that was commissioned by Nintendo. This story is so good in fleshing out Samus's character that I feel like this is a story that Sakamoto wanted to tell with Metroid Other M, but just failed completely at. Unfortunately, this was never brought over to the West, but on brighter news, the Metroid database had scanned every single page and did a shockingly competent translation of the whole thing. And you can read both volumes right now for free on their old website. If you are someone who likes manga, absolutely go read it. if you're someone who doesn't read manga at all, I still say go read it. If you're already a fan of Metroid, then this is absolute required reading. Also, the fact that this was directly referenced in Metroid Zero Mission absolutely means that this is totally canon, and nothing you can say will change my mind! Secret abilities. So there's actually a ton of extra mechanics that the Metroid games just do not tell you about. The two of the most famous ones are wall jumping and shine sparking. And the only reason why they're so well known is because they are given like tutorials in Super Metroid in the form of like these two animal characters. But there's so much more that the game just flat out never tells you about. Like the Crystal Spark. This is an ability that allows you to completely restore your health using power bombs. And there's no way you would know that this ability even exists unless you read the freaking Nintendo Power magazine, Super Metroid comic that came out around that time. And then the stuff like bomb jumping and bomb spreading, and like, there's just so much in this game that I just do not have time to cover. It is nuts. Unfortunately, a lot of these secret abilities seem to only exist in one game. For example, Zero Mission is the only game in which you can shine spark while in the morph ball. And that's not even getting into like all the weird glitches and exploits that players have found over the years. Although I can cover one. Arm pumping. I want to cover this specific exploit because I think it's the silliest and funniest out of all of them. But it's also the most useful if you really think about it. So in Super Metroid, if you change Samus's aiming in either diagonal direction while she's running, for some reason the game moves her sprite like an extra pixel forward. So if you really want to optimize like your movement speed, you just be cranking that shit. Honestly, out of all the games, Super Metroid has the most amount of glitches and exploits. Probably because it's one of the older games, so people have a lot of time to really pick it apart. But also, the game had a very troubled developmental history, so I imagine the programming is like held together by shoestrings, duct tape, and dreams. In later games, some of these glitches and exploits were actually kept in the game and designed around so that extremely skilled players can in fact still utilize them to break the game. Sequence breaking was now no longer an accident, but a feature that rewarded replayability. You can even do it in one particularly controversial title, Metroid Fusion Sequence Breaking. For those who may not know, sequence breaking refers to the fact that players found ways to like pick up all the different power-ups and items outside of the intended order that they're supposed to be found. Metroid Fusion, the fourth title in the series, is kind of controversial among the community. It's a lot more linear than the previous games, which means you're not as free to sequence break as you would be in older games. It is still possible though. In fact, one notable moment is after you acquire the speed boost, you're supposed to find another way out of your area because the door that leads to like the elevators and charging stations has been locked behind you because of story reasons. However, through a series of inputs that I can only describe as gaming sorcery, it's possible to open up a separate entrance that can get you back into the charging stations by going up a shaft and retaining your Shine Spark boost. It is absolutely wild to watch, and the designers knew that this was possible because doing so will unlock a secret message from Adam where he straight up breaks the fourth wall. The Metroid shared universe. Metroid has made cameos in all sorts of games over the years, so a lot of players like to poke fun at the idea that maybe the entire Nintendo universe is connected somehow. Samus has appeared in Mario RPG, in Kirby's Dream Land 3, in... hang on, let me pull out the list. The Metroids themselves have appeared in games like Kid Icarus, Warrior's Woods, and a screw attack item has appeared as a treasure in Kirby Superstar. But there's like even more that I just do not have time to like go over. Like, did you know like Metroid cameos have appeared in Dead or Alive and even in StarCraft? One of Noggin's older videos catalogs every single cameo that Metroid has ever made up until 2015. So if you want more, I suggest you hop over to that video. It'll be in the description. Donkey Kong. This is just referring to the fact how there's just a particularly large amount of references and cameos in the Donkey Kong franchise specifically. I attribute this mostly to the fact that the latest games, Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze, were made by Retro Studios, who were the same guys that made the Metroid Prime series. Okay, so I had to change recording locations. Hopefully it doesn't sound noticeable in the audio. It totally does, doesn't it? Golden Chorizo Treasure Chest. I'm pretty sure this is referring to a debug cheat in Super Metroid. If you enter the room of the Golden Chorizo boss battle while holding all the face buttons down, Samus just immediately has all of her power-ups and maxed out energy tanks and missiles. Silex in the secret endings to Metroid Prime 3 and Federation Force. Metroid Prime Hunters for the DS introduced a lot of new side characters who were other bounty hunters that would compete against Samus. Most of these guys were just one-offs that only appeared in Hunters alone, but one of the characters, Silex, appeared to have plans for a much bigger role in the grander story of Metroid Prime. If you collected every single collectible in Metroid Prime 3, a secret ending would be unlocked in which after Samus blasts off in her ship, immediately afterwards there's another ship which seems to share a lot of design aesthetics to Silex and follow immediately after her, implying that Silex is chasing after Samus for some unknown reasons. And in the 3DS game Federation Force, there's unlocked by similar means where it seems like someone is infiltrating the Federation Force base and stealing the last known Metroid in captivity at the time. And a pan-out shot seems to imply that, based on the design and color of the armor, that it's Silex. So we'll have to wait and see what kind of role he plays in Metroid Prime 4. Arm cannon settings. So I think this is actually referring to how you can swap out your beams in Super Metroid as mentioned earlier. However, while we're at this point, I do want to mention that in Metroid Prime, there's a hidden idle animation where Samus opens up her arm cannon and seems to fiddle with settings that you don't see in the game. Unofficial Metroid Prime Hunter servers. Multiplayer was a huge focus in Metroid Prime Hunters, to the point where there was an online service where you can matchmake with other players over Nintendo's Wi-Fi service. The service has long since been shut down, but some fans have managed to create their own private servers that you can connect to and still play Metroid Prime Hunters multiplayer on. I have no idea how active this community is, but props to them for keeping their favorite game alive. Naked Samus in Smash Bros. So this is a point I added in myself because I think it's kind of hilarious. In the original Super Smash Bros. For 64, there was a little quirk where every time a character got hit with an electric type attack, you get to see the inside of the skeleton, kind of like an old school cartoon effect. All except for Samus, because when she gets zapped, you actually get to see her body underneath the power suit. And based on the simple texture work, it looks as if she's completely naked. Now, because it's 64-bit, it's super polygonal, so it's about as titillating as Lara Croft Pyramid tits, but hey, we technically have a naked lady in a Nintendo game. And as a side bit, this was how I found out that Samus was a woman. Okay, so those are all the little details that y'all just didn't pay attention to. But now, we're about to get behind the curtains and get the dirty little developer secrets. Space Hunter. This was the working title for Metroid during its development. In fact, this title was used for so long that you can even find it still mentioned in the original manual. The reason why it was changed was, I believe, due to copyright. I think someone else had already trademarked the title Space Hunter, so Metroid was chosen as an alternative. The name itself is a combination of Metro, as in a train, and Android, because during early development, Samus was originally conceived as either a full-on robot or a cybernetic soldier. And the Metro part is referring to how you're exploring all these caverns in the world. But if you think it's kind of a stretch to compare dank, dark, labyrinthian alien worlds to a subway station, then you clearly never been to the Boston T stations.
Okay, so it's been years since I lived in Boston, so maybe things have gotten better and cleaned up. But I still ain't going on the Orange Line if my life depended on it.
Samus is named after a soccer player, specifically the player... Let's see if I can get this right the first try. Edison Ernesto Nascimento. Nailed it. Left-facing Samus. In the files of the original Metroid, if you look within the sprites, there's a series of sprites animating Samus facing the left side with her arm cannon. Chibi Zero Mission. During Metroid Zero Mission's development, the original art style was going to go for a more cutesy look to try and emulate the style of the original NES game. Ultimately, the decision was made to make it more closer to Super Nintendo and the previous Metroid Fusion games. And I think that was a decision made for the better, but I wouldn't be opposed to them like revisiting this kind of art style for like a spin-off game. They kind of went for that in Federation Force, so I like to see it in a more better receptive game. Cut Crocomire fight. In Zero Mission, Crocomire was supposed to appear as a boss. You can even find sprites of him in the game's files, but for whatever reason, he's been cut. Maybe it's due to time constraints, maybe it's because they couldn't figure out where to put him while still keeping the map loyal to the original game, like, who knows. Metroid 2 DX. So Metroid 2 was actually supposed to be remade all the way back in the 90s with a DX version, similar to how Link's Awakening DX got an updated version for the Game Boy Color. A German video game magazine even showed like a screenshot of what this Metroid 2 in color game would have looked like, but as far as we can tell, like, it just never happened, and no one really knows why. You can still play the original Metroid 2 on a Game Boy Color, but all it really does is it changes the level sprites blue and Samus and all the enemies red. It does make things a bit more visually legible, but I think we can all agree on a full color version with maybe some quality of life improvements would have been greatly appreciated. SR-388 was named after a motorcycle. The homeworld of the titular Metroids is a planet labeled SR-388, and apparently the name was inspired by the Yamaha SR-400 series that was popular at the time, and was a motorcycle that was rode by someone on the development team. However, the 400 label is a bit of a false advertisement. It's actually a 388 cylinder engine, and it was likely just rounded up to 400 or decreased to 388 because of the Speed Wars that was happening at the time. And yes, the Speed Wars was a real thing, and you should look it up. It's awesome and hilarious. In Japan, because of this, it was colloquially known as the SR-388. And speaking of feelings, I suspect that the developer in question was the composer of the Metroid series, who was known for riding a motorcycle to work, but that's only assuming he was the only one on the development team who rode motorcycles. Still, it sounds in Super Metroid. So some of the roars for the boss characters were lifted directly from Godzilla monsters, specifically Titanosaurus and Anguirus. And I gotta say, it's kinda ironic. Nintendo is so draconian about how people like play around with their IPs when it comes to like fan content stuff, but they apparently have no problem just lifting stuff directly from Toho. Stalk, Bang, and Reflet. These are scrapped enemies from Super Metroid that have been found in the game's code. The mechanical looking one is Reflet, and according to like what programming could be found of it, it may not have even been an enemy, but more like an obstacle, because it doesn't really hurt Samus, it just makes her projectiles fly in like different directions, so it's probably more of like a puzzle solving element than anything else. Bang is like the red one, the red globulous one, and it's identical to an enemy that already exists in the game, like this green one that kind of like leeches onto Samus and like drains her health and slows her down the more there are of them on her. So it's presumed that this one will behave like similarly. And the tiny Crocomire is Stalk. From what I can tell, there's no programming attached to this thing. It just kind of like stands there. Maybe this was meant to be like a baby Crocomire, similar to like the baby Dracomire. You weren't really supposed to like interact with them at all. They're just like a background set piece, which is why you can't really interact with them, but who knows. Naked Samus in Super Metroid. Samus's death animation in the games has her like explode from her power suit and reveal like her undergarments underneath. Originally in Super Metroid, she is just supposed to be flat out naked, but Nintendo decided against it at the last minute in order to avoid causing a big scandal internationally when they released the game overseas. And no, I tried looking all over the place. God knows I tried for a lot longer than I like to admit. But no, I can't find like actual sprites of this laying around. I think it's safe to say that if naked sprites were drawn up, then the bikini was drawn over it. So nothing of this remains, unfortunately. But I'm sure y'all be doing just fine. Unused sounds in the Super Metroid finale. I got nothing. Like, I seriously got nothing. I've tried asking around, I've did so much researching, I did so much digging, but I cannot for the life of me figure out what this thing is talking about. So if anyone at all has any idea what this could be, like, please let me know down in the comments, because I don't know, this thing has beaten me. Metroid 64. So if you look at the timeline of releases in the series, you'll notice that there was an 8-year gap between Super Metroid and the first Metroid Prime game, which means the entire Nintendo 64 life went without a single Metroid game. And it turns out this was because series director Sakamoto just had no idea how to translate the series into 3D. Obviously nowadays, when we look back on it, a first-person shooter was like the most obvious solution, but Japan didn't really do first-person shooters back then. Hell, they barely do it now. So nobody at Nintendo knew how to like build or design a game like that. There's a lot of rumors out there that say there was indeed like a prototype built out there, but these are all confirmed to be false. So if you ever see any footage of supposedly Metroid 64 footage or a Metroid 64 beta, it's either a hoax or a fan project. Ninja Gaiden and Metroid Other M. The Wii game Metroid Other M was developed by Team Ninja, who were the guys who created the 3D Ninja Gaiden games, and all of these titles run on their own custom engine. In Metroid Other M's files, you can find a skyscraper area that was lifted directly from one of the Ninja Gaiden games, and they basically use this area to playtest. Metroid RPG. Okay, so this was something I learned as I was already recording this video, but a while back there was this huge information leak from Nintendo that spilled a lot of beans about games that were canceled or in development or what have you, just company secrets and all that. And at the time of this recording, about like 2 weeks ago, people have found information within these leaks that Intelligent Systems were also in the talks of pitching their version of a Metroid game to Nintendo. For those of you who aren't aware, Intelligent Systems are the Fire Emblem people, and before they became the Fire Emblem people, they developed the 2 Paper Mario games that no one shuts up about, Advance Wars, and a lot of other RPG and strategy games. Now, this is purely speculation on my part. I have no evidence to like back this up, but just knowing like the studio's history, the type of games they develop, and the talent they have, I'm willing to bet a lot of money that their pitch was going to be a spin-off game that was a Metroid RPG game, or even more wild, since they create a lot of games that are strategy based and have tile manipulation. What if they were pitching an XCOM style game taking place in the Metroid universe? Fucking imagine that. Imagine Samus paddling around with other bounty hunters and Federation soldiers, and it could even have like Fire Emblem elements where every single unit actually has like a unique personality that you can talk to and have conversations with and develop bonds with, instead of just being these blank slates like the XCOM games usually do. And this would have been such a great way to expand the lore and setting of Metroid, and I want this now! Obviously, this pitch was denied, and we don't even have like concept art as to what this game could have been. All we know is like Intelligent Systems was just interested in making a Metroid game, and nothing beyond that. Maybe talks proceeded privately and was still denied. I suspect that if it was indeed an XCOM style game, maybe Nintendo didn't want this to compete with Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle, which was either still in development or right around the corner of being released. I don't know, guys. I love Kingdom Battle to pieces, but I think I want this more. Hopefully, Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime 4 combined will be successful enough that Nintendo will be inclined to make more spin-off titles between the big releases, and Next Level and Intelligent Systems pitches can be revisited, because the more I think about this, the more I need this. Wario and Fusion. Metroid Fusion was also developed on the same engine as Wario Land 4, so if you look inside the game's files, you'll find some of the assets are still in there, like the blue crystals and the stone blocks. And I kind of find it funny. I can't remember if Sakamoto was involved in Wario Land 4, but it seems like when he's not making Metroid games, he's working on the WarioWare franchise. Metroid Fusion Remake. Years ago, Mercury Steam approached Nintendo with a pitch to remake Metroid Fusion as a 2.5D action game. However, Nintendo turned it down because they feel like Metroid Fusion didn't warrant a remake, but they were impressed by Mercury Steam's work, and seeing their repertoire working on Castlevania games, they decided to give the studio a chance by letting them remake a different Metroid game, Metroid 2, which then turned into the 3DS remake, Metroid Samus Returns. Metroid Fusion was going to be pre-rendered. Okay, so this one tripped me up for a while, but thanks to some help from Super Red Plays, we were able to deduce that this was referring to a super early version of Metroid Fusion that seems to only exist in this promotional footage from E3 2001. And I gotta say, this looks absolutely nothing like the final game. First of all, the graphics both look really good and really bad. In some of these shots, it looks like it would be impossible for it to be rendered on a Game Boy Advance, but in other shots, it looks like it came from a freaking Game Boy. Samus is in all dark armor, looks really menacing actually. It doesn't even take place on the space colony like in the final game, but rather just this one singular spaceship. But what's most striking to me is the fact that there seems to be a large emphasis on gravity manipulation as the main mechanic, which is something that we still haven't really seen in any other Metroid games. This is honestly the most exciting find while I was researching this Iceberg so far. It seems that Metroid Fusion has a far more complicated development history than we initially believed, and I really want to know what happened to this version of the game. I love Fusion, how it turned out now. It's one of my favorite Metroid games of all time. I'm just super curious to see where along the lines development lines shifted from this into the final product. So this next layer of the iceberg is going to be dedicated entirely to Metroid Prime cut content, because, oh lord, there's a lot. Samus's opening monologue. There are audio files in Metroid Prime 1 that reveal Samus was supposed to speak over the opening text crawl when you first start up the game.
10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran. Descending to the very core of the pirate stronghold, Samus exterminated the energy-based parasites called Metroids and defeated Mother Brain, the leader of the pirate horde. But the space pirates were far from finished. Several pirate research vessels were orbiting Zebes while Samus fought on the surface below. After the fall of Mother Brain, the ships escaped, with the hopes of finding enough resources to rebuild their forces and take their revenge. After discovering a possible pirate colony on planet Talon 4, Samus has again prepared for war, hoping to end the pirate threat forever.
Prime 1 E3 demo. I don't know if this is referring to a possible playable demo at E3 2001, or if it's referring to the CGI trailer that came out that year, which does show some interesting changes, some stuff that was never in the final game, such as the Parasite Queen just roaming about, and possibly having an open fight with her. Meta Kraid. Kraid was originally envisioned to be part of the game. In fact, there's tons of concept art trying to figure out how exactly he would look in this new 3D world and how the boss would handle. But as far as we can tell, the only one that had any kind of modeling work done was this one, which shows a roboticized Kraid that the fans have dubbed Meta Kraid. There were a whole bunch of bosses that end up getting cut from the final game, Crocomire was supposed to make a return, and even Mother Brain herself was set to appear in the first game, and if this concept art is anything to believe, she will have just towered over Samus. Unused flying enemy. This is another cut enemy from the game, this mosquito-looking motherfucker. Unlike the other bosses and enemies though, this one actually did have a model and some animations done, so he was pretty close to being inside the game, so maybe he just ended up being too similar to the other flying pirate enemies that they ended up cutting him, but again, who knows why this was cut. Shine Spark. There is images in the game's files that seem to suggest the Shine Spark was going to be one of the collectible power-ups in Metroid Prime. However, it was never integrated. My guess is because of time concerns, but The fact that the Shine Spark never made it into the future games, whereas power-ups like the Screw Attack and Space Jump and Spider Ball that were originally planned for Metroid Prime 1, the Shine Spark still never made the cut. I guess they just couldn't figure out how to make it work in 3D and in first person. Thardos and Magmoor Caverns. Magmoor Caverns in Metroid Prime is the only area in the game that doesn't have a dedicated boss to it. And if you look inside the game's files and look at the boss character Thardos, this giant rock monster, there are actually textures that show Thardos with a more magma-like texture to it, which suggests that he was originally the boss of Magmoor Caverns. And furthermore, if you look even deeper in the game's data, you'll find an unused boss, this giant four-armed Yeti thing, that only has like a handful of animations done and nothing programmed for it. It seems like this might have been the intended boss for Phendrana Drifts, but for whatever reason, he was cut, so Thardos was plucked from one area and placed in the other. Original Phazon suit. The colorization of the Phazon suit was supposed to more closer match the color scheme of Phazon in that game. However, when they actually made the model, it didn't look sinister enough, so they changed it from blue and cyan to black and red, which I think was a good call because it just looks so much more badass. Meta Ridley's heart. Some of the concept art for Meta Ridley shows his heart exposed and other like grotesque details. Metroid Prime suit voices. There are some audio files in the game that seem to indicate that Samus's power suit was supposed to talk back to you when certain conditions were met.
Charge beam malfunction. Various suit malfunction. Morph ball malfunction. Missile malfunction. Grapple beam malfunction. Recording to logbook. Data received. Radiation detected. Poison gas detected. Danger. Defeat enemies to unlock doors. Doors unlocked.
The game has like absolutely no human dialogue or human speech whatsoever through the entire playtime, so I think this feature was removed just to like match the rest of the ambient atmosphere of the game. This feature ended up being re-included in the other later two entries of the series.
Metroid Prime 1.5. Alright, pull up a seat and grab some popcorn, because this one's going to require a bit more explaining to do. So shortly after production on Metroid Prime 1 wrapped up, Retro Studios thought they had enough time and resources to quickly cobble together smaller scale game to fill out the release between Metroid Prime 1 and 2. The game never got beyond pre-production phase with a whole bunch of concept art and a brief summary of the story and some loose gameplay ideas. The idea was that immediately after the events of Prime 1, Samus was zooming around in a ship when she comes across a distress signal, because it's always a freaking distress signal. And when she follows it, she somehow ends up in a dimension between dimensions somehow. Don't ask me. And she gets scooped up by a ship that's being run by a maniacal AI that hacks into her suit, and now Samus has to fight her way off the ship and escape. The setup was built around the fact that Retro wanted to have Samus retain all of her powers after the end of Prime 1, but that posed immediate gameplay challenges when how do you balance an entire game around a character who basically has all these busted abilities that makes her unstoppable. And it's really hard to attain challenge that way. So their way around it was to have some of her abilities disabled throughout the game, forcing the player into unfavorable circumstances that they have to play around to figure themselves how to get out of. And I gotta say, having a malicious AI that's intentionally trying to sabotage your progress is the only scenario that I can think of where Samus would have all of her powers but then not be able to use it, unlike a certain other game. It's never made clear why this game never got off the ground, other than Nintendo thought the story was fucking weird, but I think it was a more logistical issue more than anything else.
This was still the GameCube era, mind you, and back then, to produce any kind of game, regardless of how big it was, you still had to print it on Nintendo's customized discs that had to be produced in factories, that had to have a box made of it, that had to have instruction manuals printed out for it, and then shipped out overseas and then stocked on store shelves. It was a lot harder and a lot more costly to produce smaller games back then, so Nintendo probably saw that it wasn't worthwhile to make a shorter game for all that overhead, especially since the stalled success of the GameCube was kind of causing the company to bleed money as is. So they'd rather have Retro focus all their resources onto just making a full-blown sequel.
Dark Luminoth. There's some concept art that shows what a Dark Luminoth from the Dark Side of Aether would have looked like. From what I can tell, there's no scanner entries that confirm like the existence of Dark Luminoth in the actual lore, so I think this was just a concept that ended up getting scrapped altogether. The Omega Pirate in Metroid Prime 2. The multiplayer was originally going to be a lot more involved than what ended up being in the final game. There were plans to have a co-op mode where you and a second player could participate in the single player campaign together. There were a whole bunch of unused maps that you can still find in the game's files. And there's a mode where one player can take control of the Omega Pirate from the previous game, and all the other players had to battle against it.
High poly hunter models. This was another point I got slightly wrong in the first release of this video. So, Metroid Prime Hunters was going to be a launch title for the Nintendo DS, which was another factor as to why Nintendo decided to really focus in on the multiplayer, because it would have been a chance to show off the DS's wireless multiplayer functionality. However, the R&D department that was put in charge of its development hadn't had a finalized DS dev kit at the time, so as is the practice when you're on the verge of a new console generation, you make a prototype that's built to a higher spec, and then once you actually get to the dev kits available, you downgrade to whatever's been available to you. And that's what happened during Hunter's development. They found that the DS was a whole lot less powerful than they initially thought, even after all their considerations were already put in. The result is that all the models and environments they had already made had to have a reduced polygon count, more pixelized textures, and a lot of the lighting removed. But what this means is that they are higher polygon count models of Samus and all of the different bounty hunter characters that are floating out there, along with their animations. And it looks pretty sick. It's a shame we never got to see these characters outside of a bunch of Smash Bros. Trophies from Brawl.
Metroid Prime Hunters was going to be multiplayer only. So the original plan behind the DS game of Metroid Hunters was that it was supposed to be like the console games but condensed into a DS. But as it turns out, trying to fit the vast scope of the console games onto a handheld was a lot harder than the developers realized. What they found a lot easier was making the multiplayer maps, but Nintendo decided to shift all of the game's focus into multiplayer. But then again, at the very last minute, Nintendo decided that this needed to have a single player campaign, so the studio decided to just use all the multiplayer maps they have and retrofit them to also double as single player environments to traverse. This kind of ended up making single player feel tacked on and nowhere near as deep or as involved as the main game adventures, because it really was tacked on at the last minute. Original Hunter cutscene renders. So this is one I couldn't find exact information on, so this is going off my best guess. Metroid Prime Hunters had these fancy CGI cutscenes that introduced each of the playable hunters from that game. And as far as I can tell, because they had to be on DS, they're very compressed. I don't think anyone has been able to track down higher quality versions of these cutscenes, even though they must exist in order for them to be compressed this much. If anyone does end up finding these by the time this video comes out, or there is a place people have found them at, then be sure to leave in the comments. The Prime 3 channel. So to drive up more hype for the release of Metroid Prime 3 on the Wii, Nintendo released basically an app for the Wii called Channels, and they made one exclusively for Metroid Prime 3. It was basically just a place that hosted a whole bunch of trailers and promotional material. Federation Questionnaire. So this was a fun thing I didn't know about until I started doing this Iceberg video. In the American and European versions of Metroid Prime 3, you got the usual difficulty levels of easy, normal, and hard. But in the Japanese version, the game actually opens up with you having to fill out an in-universe questionnaire provided by the Galactic Federation, asking you about your experience as a bounty hunter and your experience in previous games, if you have any. And your answers based on this questionnaire would determine the difficulty level of your game. And to be honest, this is such a cool feature that I'm not sure why they didn't bring over to the West, especially since they translated all the text, so it is possible to access all this. And to be honest, this is a much more organic way to cater the difficulty level of your game to your audience, instead of the absolutely nebulous easy, normal, or hard settings. How would anyone have a frame of reference as to what's normal or what's easy or what's hard? Normal to them could either be too easy for the skill level or too hard for the skill level, but framing it as a questionnaire and then building it based on those answers, it's a neat bit of world building, and it just allows you to create a much more organic difficulty curve for your audience. Prime 3 beta leak. I think it was either 2012 or 2014, but someone had leaked a beta version of Metroid Prime 3 out into the internet. What's interesting about this beta is that it's actually running on the Metroid Prime 2 engine, but with increased RAM power. This was probably Retro's way of trying to simulate what the Wii was probably going to be capable of. They probably haven't gotten a dev kit yet, but they wanted to get a jump start on development and maybe prototype some ideas out for the game and features and such. So they wanted to get a head start on all that, which is why they tried to make it on the GameCube first and then port over what they had learned or discovered onto the final build. There's a lot of interesting stuff about this beta, but there's separate videos that go into more detail as to what's in them, so I'll leave links to them in the description. The Metroid Prime comic. Okay, so I had completely forgotten about this until I researched this Iceberg video, but I remember this shit. In 2002, Nintendo Power ran a short comic series that was basically recapping the events of Metroid Prime in 24 pages. The artwork was done by Dreamwave, which is a subsidiary of Dark Horse Comics, and I gotta say guys, the story may be very minimal, but the artwork is just gorgeous, absolutely on point. The comic itself is a nice, light, and fun read, although there are a lot of inconsistencies with the actual game, but I think that actually makes it more fun to read. It's engaging to try and spot the differences. The Metroid database has an archive of this comic, so give it a read when you have a chance. It's great. Oh, okay. That's a lot, but I'm gonna be real with you guys. The stuff we've covered so far, this is the easy shit. And you wanna know why I say that? Because more than half these points were already explained to me by the 2 Did You Know Gaming episodes. From here on out, this is the obscure shit you're not going to find a lot of info on unless you do a lot of digging through Reddit or the Metroid database, so... And even then, there's some stuff that's spotty. Blood of the Chozo. So first of all, some context for those who may not know who the Chozo are. They're basically a race of alien birds that are probably the most critical species in the Metroid universe, lore-wise. They are so important to the overarching story, even though they're actually extinct by the time of the actual events of the games. To make a very long and nerdy story short, they're basically responsible for creating most of the technology we see in the universe, and are responsible for creating the Galactic Federation, because ultimately their main goal was to create galactic-wide peace and harmony. However, the Blood of the Chozo event explored the possibility if there were a violent faction of Chozos. Basically, this was an officially endorsed fanfiction writing event that was hosted on Nintendo Power's website. The idea was that Nintendo Power would provide a story, they would provide a situation, a handful of rules and starting characters and locations, but otherwise, all the writers who wanted to be part of this were just free to make up whatever they wanted. They were free to create their own characters, their own
alien races, their own planets. This was basically their playground, because this was at a time when the lore of the Metroid universe was not very well established. It was actually really cool stuff. I don't know, guys, I'm not really familiar with like fanfiction writing spaces. I just very recently got into fanfiction myself, but I've never heard of anything like this happen before, at least not for a video game, and certainly not for a Nintendo game. This writing event actually accrued over 6,000 entries on the forums, like fleshing out like this super massive story. But unfortunately, most of this is completely lost, because this was actually a limited time event, and once it was over, Nintendo Power basically shut down the servers that were hosting all the threads. A handful of these threads were recovered and archived by the Metroid database, but most of this story is just completely lost, and that is just like heartbreaking to hear, man. I know fanfiction writing has a stigma to it and a dirty reputation of being like either amateurish or just completely smutty, but there are some talented writers out there who did get their start in fanfiction, and there are some people who actually pour a lot of heart and soul into these stories and actually make something that's worthwhile. There are some people out there that do put genuine hard work into these stories, and the fact that it just got deleted out of what I can only assume is just pure negligence is just like shameful, you know? Now that the Metroid universe is so much more established and has an actual like canon and like a really interesting world setting, there's even more room to play around with and even more possibilities to explore, so I think this is something that should happen again. Whether it's endorsed by Nintendo or not, I don't think really matters, because I think this is something that fans themselves could organize, so I would love to be a part of something like this if the Blood of the Chosen were to happen again. Secret Worlds. Secret Worlds are a type of glitch that exists in basically every Metroid game.
Okay, I'm gonna be real with y'all. I have no idea what the fuck is going on or how these things work. All this is just way too galaxy-brained for my feeble gamer mind to like properly understand.
I think the basic idea, and mind you, I'm probably botching this horribly, but I think the basic idea is that you're tricking the game into thinking you're somewhere else when you start at an entirely different non-connected location. Like for example, if you start in Brinstar and just do enough of like gamer sorcery, you can actually warp to an entirely different part of the map, but the game itself still thinks you're in Brinstar. I think, again, there's other videos out there that probably explain this much better than my simple monkey brain can ever summarize, so I'm just gonna leave those in like in the research playlist, because this is Super Mario 64 parallel universe shit, okay? Engage Ridley, motherfucker. As stated earlier, when you're typing passwords into the password screen, what you're really doing is rewriting the game code to change values within it. So if you type in the phrase engage Ridley, motherfucker, what it ends up doing is it messes with the in-game timer, the thing that measures like how long you've been playing to determine what type of ending you get, and it gives you an amount of time where you have to be playing for years on straight. What this does is like, I think it overloads the ROM or something, or like it just like clogs up the programming so much that you get some really trippy effects going on in the game. Although ironically enough, it does remove the Ridley boss battle. The game is so unstable in this state that depending on what version of the game you're playing on, it may cause the game to crash or possibly even brick your system, forcing you to do a hard reset. Profile ruining other M glitch. So while you're playing other M, there's a chance you can completely botch things up and make it impossible to progress through the story. There's a passageway where if you don't do the sequence as originally intended by the developers, it's possible to get yourself trapped in this room because the door locks behind you and now you can't get past the door you're supposed to, which basically means you're soft locked out of the rest of the game. This glitch was so infamous that Nintendo actually had to create a patch to try and like remove the glitch from the game. And again, this was like in an era when Nintendo just did not do online patches at all. Samus plays the cello. So in the NES port of Tetris, a bunch of Nintendo characters make cameos in the game as they play various instruments playing the main Tetris theme. And one of these characters is Samus playing the cello. I don't know why this is so funny to me, but I want this to be canon. Samus and Captain N Comic,
So, Mother Brain, the main antagonist for Metroid and Super Metroid, she appeared as one of the main villains in the TV show.
I'm awesome.
But Samus herself never made an appearance. However, she was a main character in the Captain N comic books. In fact, the comic has its own complete different cast of characters. The only returning ones are Captain N himself, Pit, and Lana. In fact, like, Samus and Lana are kind of in competition for Captain N's affection, but I kind of just want to point everyone out how this is basically two grown women lusting after a teenage boy. In fact, Samus's entire characterization is just kind of gross overall. Kind of greedy, she tends to prioritize getting paid over everything else. Kind of selfish, because she puts her own needs before everyone else's. Not as insulting as other M, but it's... This comic was made back when Metroid wasn't really built up as a world, and Samus still didn't have a lot of characterization, so the writers were just doing whatever they wanted with her. This was a really weird era for Metroid media in general. Samus and Joey manga. This one's kind of an oddity, honestly. In 2001, right before the release of Metroid Fusion, I guess Nintendo wanted to reintroduce audiences to Samus and her world, because up in that point it had been like 8 years since the last Metroid game. So they commissioned an original manga series starring Samus and an original character named Joey, who's this plucky anime boy who gets wrapped up in Samus's adventures, and Samus just has to like put up with him. This is basically if Samus was just placed into a shonen anime. If that's your type of trash, then I think this will be an entertaining read for you. But otherwise, it's alright. I mean, you can do worse with an hour and a half of your time. The artwork, though, is absolutely stunning. The author and writer is absolutely talented in this department, and it's kind of a shame that he never really did anything beyond this series after that. Beforehand, he did a bunch of like mangas for Mega Man, but ever since he just kind of like dropped off the radar in the manga world. He now works in, I think, in healthcare in Japan, from last I read. Again, your enjoyment is going to vary widely based on how receptive you are of Joey himself and whether or not you find him obnoxious or not. But once again, the Metroid database has scanned every single page, because this wasn't released in America, and translated everything, and you can check it out for free on the original website. So if you got time and you like Metroid, give it a shot. Samus plays Zelda. So besides all the comics and like manga I've mentioned up until now, there was even more printed media for Metroid, especially for the original Metroid back in the day. One of which was basically a guidebook that also doubled as a manga parody of the game. And in the introduction sequence, Samus is playing Zelda as she's waiting to like arrive on Zebes. To be honest, guys, there are even more comics and manga that aren't even mentioned on this iceberg. You know that Captain N comic I was talking about? There's another manga that's basically a Japanese equivalent to all of that. There's also a short little comic strip book series. I think it's a column that runs on Famitsu Weekly, and Super Metroid had a bunch of those, in which Samus is characterized as being really obsessed with round objects for some reason and being round herself. There's so much media in Japan only, and I just can't escape the irony that Nintendo seems to pour so much marketing effort for Metroid in its home country, and yet the series somehow still always does way better in the West than it ever has in Japan. Super Metroid Anti-Piracy. So Super Metroid does have anti-piracy measures, but it's kind of like boring, to be honest. It just brings you to like a screen that tells you like stealing is bad, and that's it. I think what this point is really referring to was a video that went semi-viral within the community. It was basically part of like this wider trend of players supposedly discovering messed up anti-piracy images in video games, but they were really just like jump scares or part of a poorly written creepypasta somewhere else. It kind of reminds me how like many years ago there was like this secret console kill screen trend that was going on for a while, and it also was just big glorified jump scares. Shadow freezing. This is referring to an exploit within Metroid Prime Hunters. The character Noxus, his special exclusive weapon is the Judicator, which is basically like a freezing shotgun. It's really powerful but has a really short range. However, if you point directly down or upwards while you're firing it at full charge, it actually completely bypasses the short range and acts as a long range weapon instead.
Don't ask me to explain why this happens, because quite frankly, I don't have enough brain cells to understand this either.
Metroid Prime 3 dev messages. So in the beginning of Metroid Prime 3, your ship has this little console that you type into to grant access to Galactic Federation space. You only use it once during the opening of the game, and it's never used again. I think it was just an excuse to show off the Wii pointer. However, if you type in certain combinations on your console, you can discover secret messages from the Japanese staff over at Nintendo.
こんにちは、任天堂の岩田です。社長って傍から見てるとどうかわかりませんが、実際結構大変なんですよ。忙しくて大変な時にどんどんやつれていくと人は同情してくれるんですが、私は忙しいと太る方なんで、太れば太るほどなんか何も感じてないんじゃないかって誤解されてるみたいで、非常に不本意です。あ、聞こえます。宮本です。メトロイド遊んでる人たち聞こえますか？楽しいでしょう。もうね、僕もメトロイド関わり始めて何年もなりますけども、本土のは今までの中で最高でしょう。絶対最後まで遊んでみてね。じゃあね。
Little Birdie. In Metroid Other M, while Samus is stomping around the bottle ship, she runs into this little Furby thing. Would you believe me if I told you that this was a baby Ridley? Yeah. I have so many questions. So this thing looks like it only has 2 limbs, but he grows like 4 in his full adult form. Like how? Why? His wings are like so tiny.
Why
How is he able to fly? Fur? Like it's not really known for like mammals to like lose fur as they get older, because that's a really advantageous thing to have. If anything, they actually gain fur as they get older. The context of this craziness is that the Galactic Federation were studying Samus's power suit, and they managed to scoop up some of his blood and guts that was still on Samus's suit after she blew him up, and they created a clone of him, except this clone was able to like age rapidly throughout the game. So you first see him in like his Furby form, then like the awkward teenage phase, and then you see full-blown Ridley at the end. Honestly, I just feel like this whole thing was an arbitrary plot twist for the sake of having a plot twist. Red Crateria. In the data for Super Metroid, there's an alternate tile set for Crateria, which seems to paint the entire place as red and has this big ominous like sky hanging in the background. I think this might have been like for the finale, while during like the final escape sequence, like Crateria was supposed to look like this while Samus is trying to escape to make it extra dangerous looking, but clearly it was never ended up using. I think there's a couple of other tile sets in the game that are color swaps of other areas in the game. Check out the cutting room floor. They have even more material on cut content from Super Metroid that even I couldn't come up with here, or on the Iceberg. Samus was supposed to be in Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. In Mario & Luigi, there's this cafe area where you can use all like the little bean items you've been collecting and combine them to create special items that have extra healing and buff properties that you can't normally buy in other stores in the game. But every time you discover a new combination of bean mocha, it causes Professor Egat to appear and deliver like a little spiel, a little gag, and he gives you one of his inventions as a reward for discovering a new recipe essentially. Originally, however, it wasn't supposed to be EGAT, it was supposed to be other Nintendo characters popping in as a quick cameo and giving Mario & Luigi the item. And yes, Samus was supposed to make an appearance as well. It's unknown, at least to me, why change happened. It seemed like a very last minute change, so who knows what happened. I feel like I'm saying that a lot the past couple of videos. Spore Spawn %. This is actually a speedrunning category for Super Metroid. Basically, the speedrun community has all collectively found out that skipping the Spore Spawn boss, which guards like the first super missile you can get in the game, it's just so much faster if you just like skip him entirely. But some guys within the community felt so bad that our little plant boy can't get any attention that they create a whole separate category where you are expected to try and like encounter Spore Spawn and try and kill him as fast as you can, just so the poor guy can make some kind of appearance. let's just take a moment to give a shout out to Plan Gang over here.
Project Valkyrie.
Next Level Games is a second-party developer that's known for games like Punch-Out for the Wii, the Luigi's Mansion games on 3DS and Switch. At some point they approached Nintendo and pitched to them their vision of a Metroid game. All that exists of this pitch is this 2D artwork that people have found, and all that we know about it was that it was a 2.5D side-scroller, much like the classic games. Apparently this pitch was denied and it never got farther than this, which means they probably never even built anything. The cancelled Metroid multiplayer game. Alright, I'm actually really excited to talk about this because I don't see a lot of people mentioning this, but it's a lot to go over. So, Mercury Steam, they approached Nintendo with wanting to make a Metroid game of their own. They had their own vision for a 3D Metroid Prime style game, and not only did they want to make a title for the Wii U, but they also wanted to have a 3DS game to coincide the release. Now, ultimately, Nintendo shot down the pitch, even though Mercury Steam already spent a lot of time working on a prototype, mostly because Nintendo said that the Wii U was dying, so it would be better if they just focused on a 3DS title that would be smaller and quicker to produce, and probably more profitable. They had their selection of what they wanted to do. They wanted to do a remake of Metroid Fusion, but Sakamoto decided to instead give them a remake of Metroid 2, which was a game that Sakamoto had no hand in creating, and was also a game that was in desperate need of a remake anyways. So that's how we got Samus Returns, but their 3D prototype didn't go to waste. They had plans to turn it into an original franchise in the event that Nintendo turned their pitch down, and in 2017, that original idea was revealed to be Raiders of the Broken Planet, a hero shooter. At the peak when hero shooters were already saturating the market, and it was by a studio that at the time was still not very well known and unproven, and was riddled with a shit ton of microtransactions at the height of anti-microtransaction movement. Yeah, suffice to say, the game kind of flopped upon release with very little fanfare. Not due to a lack of effort by Mercury Steam, because they did earnestly try to do a lot of unique things with this gameplay, including much more robust melee combat system that you didn't normally see in third-person shooters. And the character designs were neat. That's about it. I think Mercury Steam immediately knew that they had a sinking ship on their hands, so in a desperate attempt to course correct, they turned the game into free-to-play, and when that didn't work, they decided to just rebrand the entire thing completely from the ground up and relaunch it as a new game called Space Lords, going free-to-play from the start. But once again, this ended up not really doing much to help the game's sales. The microtransactions were still incredibly intrusive. Players were still kind of complaining about some of the gameplay, but most damning of all, players just were not engaging with the characters, the world, and certainly not the writing, which a lot of people cite was trying too hard to be Marvel-esque. So yeah, once again, Space Lords didn't take off, and it's impossible to find any matches for the game now, even though servers are still up and running. Honestly, I feel bad for Mercury Steam, because this was clearly a project they poured a lot of heart and soul into, and you can just tell by the presentation and the affection they try to show their characters and their setting. But ultimately, for the reasons I said it before, it just did not click with gamers across the internet. The reason why they wanted to make this a Metroid title was because the fact that it would be an established and recognizable franchise would already do so much of the heavy lifting for marketing. Metroid is a familiar universe to a lot of people, and is primed for spin-offs like this to really expand its setting, because the original pitch was that Samus was going to be palling around with multiple different bounty hunters or Federation soldiers and everything in between. It's hard to tell which ideas were poached from that original Metroid concept and placed into Space Lords, but you can definitely tell, it's a bunch of space vagrants chumming around on an abandoned planet trying to find mysterious objects from an extinct civilization. So yeah, definitely overlap in terms of themes right there. And I gotta say, now that Mercury Steam have proven themselves twice over with the Metroid brand, in both gameplay and in respecting its universe, I think now more than ever that original pitch might still happen. Metroid Dread has made Nintendo a nice fat stack. Like, at the time of this recording, Metroid Dread is the most successful Metroid game in the entire franchise, even eclipsing Metroid Prime, catapulting it back into the limelight. I think we're in a position to see a lot more Metroid spin-offs like we used to do in the mid-2000s with shit like Metroid Pinball and Metroid Prime Hunters. And now that Mercury Steam has twice over the experience of trying to launch a game like this, I think they've earned enough knowledge on how to pull a game like this off. Third time's the charm is what I'm saying. Keep an eye on Mercury Steam and Metroid in the near future, because if we end up seeing an announcement of a multiplayer Metroid game, or at least a Metroid game that has a much bigger emphasis on multiplayer, even if it's solely a multiplayer-based game, and it's by Mercury Steam, I think we have a lot of reason to be excited. Alright, you hear that? That's the rain picking up. Which means we're about to go deeper, boys. This is where all the weird shit is. Pirate Morph Ball experiments. So the pirates are actually firmly aware of like Samus's abilities and even try to like reverse engineer some of them, including the Morph Ball. However, trying to reverse engineer technology in which your entire body mass is suddenly condensed into like a tiny space, it goes as well as you expected it would. Orpheon Caged Creatures. The Orpheon is the space station that Samus lands on in the beginning of Metroid Prime. It's a ship owned by the space pirates, and on board you can actually find a lot of their experiments, including a room filled with all these like caged-in creatures that you will not find anywhere else in the game as like enemies. Some of these are throwbacks to 2D games, while others are completely mysterious. One of them is a tube filled with like all like these dismembered parts of a creature that we never see in the game. Fun fact, later in the game, after the Orpheon has crashed onto Talon 4, you can actually revisit it, and you can go to the same room and find that all of the cages have been broken open, suggesting that the creatures either died or escaped when the ship crashed. SA1446878. Fuck man, that's too many numbers. I can't remember all that. This is basically the serial number to Samus's power suit, okay? Space pirate subspecies. There's a lot of inconsistencies in how the space pirates are depicted throughout the games. Like, this is how they look like in the 2D games. This is how they look like in the 3D games. This is how they look like in the 3D games again. And this is how they look like in the 3D games a third time. And this is how they look like in the mangas. There's like no coherency with any of it. And it has led a lot of fans to speculate that A, there's a bunch of subspecies of space pirates, or B, they're actually true to their name in that the space pirates aren't actually a single race, but rather like a collection of different races that all work together because they're ostracized by like the Galactic Federation or something. Or C, there's a lot of evidence especially in the Prime games, that suggests that the pirates changed their genetic and physical makeup to better adapt whatever planet they're currently residing on. Only problem with that theory is that the space pirates in Metroid Prime 3 all look the same, despite the game taking place on multiple different planets, although in the manga it is confirmed that they try to change their body types to better fit Zebas's hostile environment, so I guess there's some credence to that. The deleter is James Pierce. In Metroid Other M, there was this subplot about how there was an insurgent within Adam's core team that was sent to sabotage the entire mission, and there was like this big overhanging mystery as who in the squad was this insider that Samus dubbed the deleter, which sounds like someone's Xbox gamer tag when they were 13. But as it turns out, like, this entire subplot goes absolutely nowhere because the entire crew gets killed eventually in the story, including the insider. In fact, it was so unclear in the story as to who this insider was supposed to be that it had to be the Japanese guidebook that made it clear that James Pierce was in fact the deleter. Metroids are unicellular. God, try saying that 3 times fast. Some people think that Metroids are actually just one giant cell. but I'm not sure if this is really true, because a lot of people mistake that this is like the Metroid's only form, because most of the games this is the most you ever get to see of them, but Metroids actually have like an evolutionary line, and they seem to grow into like increasingly more complex creatures. Something like this would just not be possible with a unicellular organism. I don't know, there's nothing in the official lore to back up the idea that Metroids are just made out of one cell initially. Ridley can talk. Yeah, he can. In the Metroid manga, fully capable of speaking in full sentences. I guess a lot of people outside of the fandom like don't realize that Ridley's actually a space pirate commander. Though I don't blame them, because Ridley never talks in any of the games, so people just assume he's like this mindless purple space dragon. Hell, even in the one game where Samus never shuts the fuck up, Ridley still doesn't talk. But speaking of Ridley, Ridley is native to Zebes. No, actually. I think this is referring to how in the older comics, before like continuity was really established, a lot of the comics interpreted Zebes as the home planet of the space pirates, but in truth the space pirates are an invasive species to Zebes. They came and conquered the planet, it's not really their own. Ridley ate Samus's family. Again, no. In fact, according to the manga, Ridley only ever actually killed her mother. Her father, meanwhile, sacrificed himself by blowing up all the energy fuel that the space pirates were initially stealing, preventing them from utilizing it for themselves. I think this is actually referring to a flashback sequence that happened much later in the manga, where Samus was going through a PTSD episode and was like hallucinating seeing Ridley eat her family. Yep. Yeah, man, this comic got really fucking dark in places, and this was published by Nintendo, man.
Okay, quick correction while I'm still editing this video, and if you hear the baby, please don't mind her. But I was skimming through the manga in order to gather still images for this video, and there is in fact a part where Ridley tells Samus that he had to feed off of the corpses of the K2L colonists in order to keep himself alive from the brink of death. But Grey Voice immediately calls out the story as bullshit, so I stand by what I've been saying.
Ridley dies in Super Metroid. Once again! No! Oh wait, this one's actually true. Yeah, technically speaking, Super Metroid was the last canonical appearance of Ridley, cause in Metroid Fusion, that wasn't actually him, that was his frozen corpse possessed by the X-Parasite. And in Metroid Other M, that technically wasn't him either, that was a clone of him, which means Ridley is fucking dead. Unless they turn him into a robot for the 5th fucking time. Okay, that was the last point about Ridley. Geoform 187. This is the nickname of Ridley. I lied! I don't know where this name came from, actually. A name given by the Galactic Federation or something? This is the name of his actual species? I don't know where this number came from. I just found it on the Metroid Wiki, and that's about it. So if someone can like point to me where in-game it says this, leave it down in the comments. And now that was the last point about Ridley. I swear this time. At least for this layer. Cut enemies from Metroid Prime 3. So these next actual several points listed on the iceberg, they're all actually names of cut enemies from Metroid Prime 3. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of coverage on all the cut content from Metroid Prime 3 on YouTube, because the obsessive gamer still hasn't finished making part 2 yet. Come on, man, we're waiting on Metroid Prime 2 cut content. Hurry up, man!
Oh shit, he actually did make it while I was still editing this.
But yeah, these are all the enemies that haven't appeared in the game. Air Thorns. Basically, there's this area where you go through the morph ball, in which the air is filled with like these floating mechanical things. Because you're in the morph ball, it's impossible to scan them. However, if you cheese the game through secret worlds, it is possible to enter this area without the morph ball form, allowing you to scan them. And there actually is in fact an entry for these in the logbook. Zoomers are an invasive species. Zoomers are also known as Gamers. They're basically the Goombas of the Metroid franchise. They're the very first enemy you encounter in the first game, and they've made an appearance in almost every entry since, as basically just harmless obstacles. But it turns out they're actually a lot more deadlier than normal Goombas. In Metroid Prime Hunters, it is revealed that they actually carry a flesh-eating bacteria
that has caused complete ecological disruption on Zebes that has led to the extinction of several different species. And this thing's on multiple planets, man, what the hell? Samus has 2 dads. So Zebes is such a hostile planet to live on. I don't know if there's just something in the atmosphere or something, but normal humans were to stay on it for too long, they would just straight up die. Which is really bad if you're trying to raise a 3-year-old. In order for the Chozo to adopt Samus, they had to genetically re-engineer her body so that she can survive in the environment. And the DNA that they used to help with this transformation was from the character Grey Voice. And the manga points us out that Samus has 2 dads. She has her real biological daddy, and she has Bird Daddy. From now on, Grey Voice shall now be referred to as Bird Daddy. And no, I don't think Metroid Dread has retconned this. Wrecked ship origins. One of the areas in Super Metroid is the wrecked ship of some kind that's submerged partially in water. Nobody knows where this ship came from, and it's never explicitly stated. Some fans theorize that Metroid Zero Mission kind of retconned this point, because the space pirate ship that you get to explore in Metroid Zero Mission seems to have some similarities to this wrecked ship, including like this little gonk droid-like thing, and like these giant electro ball things that only ever appear in the wrecked ship and in the space pirate ship. There's very clear connections being made here, but again, nothing's made conclusive. In fact, the interior looks entirely different than what it did in Metroid Zero Mission, so still kind of a mystery that's up in the air as to like where the ship came from, if it's even relevant. Maybe this isn't even that same ship from Metroid Zero Mission, but maybe it's a space pirate ship that just crashed into the planet at one point. AU-313 in Skytown.
Okay, so this was another one that tripped me up when I was first making this video a year ago. But thankfully, Nip Coyote, the original creator of one of the Iceberg images, was able to help me out with this one. When you go to Skytown, the Aurora unit that's stationed there is labeled as Aurora Unit 217. However, all the computer monitors that surround it incorrectly label it as Unit 313. However, when I tried to find footage of this, I couldn't find anything. None of the computer monitors showed this glitch. I think what must have happened was that this was an error that was present only on the original Wii release, and when the Metroid Prime Trilogy released later down the line, they corrected it or just outright removed the mention altogether.
Samus's age. We don't actually know what Samus's canonical age is. It is not mentioned anywhere, not in the games, not in the Metroid Prime Codex entries, not in any extracurricular activity, any of the extended universe stuff, absolutely nowhere. It's not even listed on a Smash Bros. Trophy, so this has led to a lot of speculation as to what her possible age is, and I have my own theory, but keep in mind, I'm making a lot of assumptions here and a lot of leaps in logic. I at least like to think it's rooted in some type of logic that we can at least go off of. So here we go. So the only times that Samus's age is confirmed is in the manga, when she's 3 years old at the K2L incident, and in a time skip where it shows her at 14 years old training with the Chozo. After that, it does another time skip in which her age becomes completely ambiguous again. But at this point, she is already a soldier in the Federation Army. Now, assuming that the age of recruitment has remained the same in the future, Samus would have to be at least 18 years old to be part of this army. But at the same time, she's been part of the Federation long enough to already have like a record and a reputation as being someone who's constantly going on her own and disobeying orders, but she's also drawn still as like a teenager. The artist has a very clear distinction as to when Samus is a teenager and when she's a full-on adult. So with all these assumptions in mind, I am hypothesizing that at this point in the manga, Samus is 19 years old. Now why is this important? It's because at this point of the story, it introduces a new side character, a little girl that Samus rescues from the space pirates. This little girl reappears later in the story after another time skip. This time, Samus is a full-on adult now and deep into her bounty hunter career, and this takes place right before the events of Zero Mission. Now this little girl is a fresh recruitment in the Federation Army, having been inspired by Samus and her exploits. So that means that this little girl is now 18,
Assuming that she recruited as soon as she turned 18, of course. Now, the age of this little girl is also never stated, so we're going to assume that she's 6 years old, or at least within like the 4 to 6 range, purely based on how the artist has drew her. Like, we've seen how they drew Samus as a 3-year-old, so she's clearly not that young, but she's also not so old to be like a teenager, so we'll say somewhere between the ages 6 and 4. Now, going by my estimates as to her being 6 years old, and she's now 18 when we see her again, that would mean it'd have to be roughly, hang on, I gotta math really quick, 12 years since the time that we last saw her, which means, let's see, 19 plus 12, Samus would be 31 by the time the events of Metroid Zero mission start. After that, well, we don't know because it's never made clear how much time has passed between. I think we can roughly say with confidence that Samus is in her early to mid 30s throughout the franchise that we've seen so far. And I'm sticking with this idea because honestly, we need more badass female characters who are in their 30s, you know? Women's value in society is so much dictated by their youth and their appearance, and by the time they reach 30, so many of them think that their lives are over because 20 is like the perceived ideal age for womanhood. But nah. We need a badass bitch like Samus to show that you can still not only kick ass in your 30s, but also be beautiful while doing it. And I don't think that's too old to still be part of a business like this, because hundreds of years in the future, medical technology has definitely skyrocketed by then, so for all we know, 60 is the new 30 by then. I mean, shit, they saved her from near death like 2 times at least in the series, so. And something else to keep in mind is that she's also infused with Chozo DNA, and the Chozo have been shown to live extremely long lives, so that may have also contributed to her being super athletic and super strong even at her 30s. Pirate homeworld name. So, in Metroid Prime 3, we actually get to visit the supposed pirate homeworld for the first time. And its name, according to the pirate's logbook, is called,
I'm not even gonna try and bother to pronounce that.
Which translates to, in their language, big booty. Y'all laugh, but I think this actually calls into question as to whether or not this is actually their homeworld. I don't think they're referring to booty as in butts, but as in like treasure, because, you know, they're pirates. You can't get a bigger haul than like an entire planet, so that's why I think it was named that way. So it makes me wonder if this really is their homeworld or it's just another planet that was conquered by them. That's my personal theory. Zebes Invasion Order. Okay, so imagine this. Combine a choose-your-own-adventure novel with Dungeons and Dragons, and it's Metroid themed. That's basically Metroid Zebes Invasion Order. It is a promotional book made like a couple months after the release of Metroid in Japan. This thing is like really wild, man. I'm honestly surprised like we haven't seen more books like this. It's kind of like a single player D&D adventure, but this book is also very historically significant for multiple reasons. For one, this is the first time outside of the games we get to see Samus without her helmet on, and for some reason they made her hair black. We also see her gunship for the first time, and it looks absolutely nothing like anything else that will come after it. But honestly, I want to play this for like the unique gameplay experience alone. Unfortunately, this was just another one of those things that never got released outside Japan, and finding hard copies for this was absurdly expensive because these are now a rare commodity. But some mad lad out there not only translated his entire copy in English, he also made a program where you can basically simulate the game without having to use pen and paper, and it keeps track of some of your stats and weapons and ammo and stuff all on its own, so you don't have to do it yourself. Of course, once again, the Metroid database has this program available to play for free. Did You Know Gaming recently did a whole episode covering this exclusively, so if you want to know even more details about this, I'm going to include it in the research playlist. At some point, I kind of want to make a whole separate video of me just doing a playthrough of this thing, because I'm just deeply fascinated by this book just as a concept, especially for my own ambitions to make a tabletop RPG. The Metroid Prime. So the Metroid Prime series is actually named after the titular boss character of the first game, which is called the Metroid Prime. And this thing is
an enigma, honestly. Okay, so first of all, the logbook of this thing is completely different in the US in the first print of the game compared to everywhere else in the world. Originally, the logbook said how the Metroid Prime got there because originally just a regular Metroid that just snuck itself inside the impact crater before it got sealed off by the Chozo hundreds of years ago. But the Metroids are actually a fairly recent creation in the timeline of Metroid universe. They only existed on SR388, and they were created on that planet specifically to hunt down the X-parasites. So what these were doing in Talon 4, decades or possibly even hundreds of years prior to that, just makes absolutely no sense. And I think the writers realized that didn't make any sense. Now the implication is that the Metroid Prime got there because it was actually one of the Metroids that the space pirates brought with them, and it just somehow snuck itself inside the crater even though it's been sealed off the entire time. Okay, this makes no sense either. In fact, oh god, this thing makes me ask so many more questions about the lore and setting. How are these things floating? Why is it that the Metroid Prime is able to the space pirates are able to bring a whole egg? Does that mean that they're able to escape clean? I don't think it is because they didn't have a Tourian. So in fact, the fact that the Metroid... Oh man, and that's not even getting into the weird connection with Phazon, and that's that we're going to have to get into in the next layer, and oh god, I'm going to have to grab a snack and eat first, guys. Samus was supposed to be in Fortnite, so while Epic was in their crusade against Apple, some court documents got leaked over the internet, and a lot of them revealed Epic's intentions to reach out to a whole bunch of other companies for crossover events. And one of them was Nintendo, and Epic wanted to reach out to use Samus Aran for the then upcoming Hunters event. So once news broke out of this, everybody was clamoring for confirmation of this, but nothing ended up ever coming out of this. The Twitter Fortnite news later then tweeted out that the deal fell through and that was never going to happen. The reason being that Nintendo wanted Samus to appear only for Switch players, but for some reason this couldn't be done. Probably has to do with how Epic Games engineered Fortnite. I don't think they would have been able to make characters exclusive to just one console. I don't even need to check this guy's sources to see if he's right. I fully believe him because this is such a Nintendo thing to do. Nintendo's very protective with how their properties appear. The one consistent thing with all the crossovers is that it has to be only on their system, and whenever there is a crossover, it can only happen when the game in question is a Switch exclusive. But Fortnite is a cross-platform game, one that's available on all consoles and on PCs, and I guess Epic Games couldn't figure out a way to make Samus exclusive only on the Switch without completely rewriting their entire engine. I guess it just wasn't happening. Samus was supposed to be in Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Now, we ain't talking about Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 for the Switch. We're talking about the super old school Ultimate Alliance for the PlayStation 2, Wii, Xbox 360, all those consoles. The story goes that Activision was developing the PS2 version first, and then they were going to port it onto all the other systems later, including the Wii, which was right around the corner. Now, of course, Activision being Activision, they rushed the development, so they barely had time to do anything, including setting aside time for the Wii port, but they wanted to sneak in a couple of unlockable characters exclusive to the Wii version, and those characters would have been Samus and Link. In fact, we even have footage of Samus being playable in a demo build. I think the logic was because they had so little time to work on the port that they decided they can just kill two birds with one stone and develop the Nintendo exclusive characters on the PlayStation 2 build, just keep it locked away or keep it only on the demo version only, and then bring all that over to the Wii port once they were done. However, the fact that Nintendo characters were existing on a console that wasn't their own, even if it was never intended to be released, pissed off Nintendo enough that they denied the characters to be included at all in the final version. Other M was erased from canon. Metroid Other M was so poorly received, and I don't think it met sales expectations either, so this game was such an embarrassment that Nintendo has made a concerted effort to not mention it ever since it released. Even with the upcoming news of Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Dread, there seems to be absolutely no references made to the events of that game or its characters. Even Yoshio Sakamoto has made a lot of public statements where he regret how the game ended up turning out and how he felt responsible for making it the way it did. So I think it was just in everyone's best interest that they subtly erased it from canon, which is really ironic considering Other M was like in development at the time. Nintendo was actually trying to like promote the idea that the Metroid Prime games were non-canon, and that Other M was like the true successor of all the 2D Metroid games. They seem to have backpedaled on that a lot these days, and I think it was for the better. Nintendo waited until AM2R was completed before canceling it. This is exactly what it sounds like. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't entirely buy this theory, but I can see where they're coming from with this idea, because it does seem really suspicious that Nintendo seemed to only care about this fan game right as soon as it got done. But to be honest, like, I've been a Nintendo fan my whole life. I know how these people work, and I feel like it's just more of a horrible coincidence. Project M was a super popular Super Smash Bros. Brawl mod that was around for years and was so popular with the Smash community that it was started to feature in a bunch of events and was considered a headliner right alongside Smash Bros. Melee. Nintendo knew that this mod existed and they didn't do anything about it because they felt like it didn't affect their bottom line. Kind of the same way how they feel like the Mother 3 fan translation doesn't affect their bottom line, hence why they've never done anything about it, even though the mod is very public and very well known. They haven't done anything about it because they're not doing anything with the Mother franchise. They don't see it as a financial threat to them. They never considered AM2R to be a financial threat to them until they started to make a Metroid 2 remake of their own, and that just happened to coincide when Dr. M was finishing up his work. So I think it's just a very unfortunate coincidence, and I'm very critical about Nintendo when it comes to like its practices and how it treats its fan mods and fan communities. Valve and Sega have proven that fan mods have done nothing but enrich franchises and keep them alive and relevant even during like their darkest times. I don't think Nintendo was in any position to like lose money from AM2R being released, even if it was free. If anything, it just did nothing but promote the franchise even more to more people. It was basically free advertising for them, and they just completely shut it down. The animals are X-parasites. This is referring to a long-standing theory for Metroid Fusion. So these little space ostriches and space monkey things were introduced in Super Metroid and served as in-game tutorials on how to use abilities like the Shine Spark and Wall Jump, and they reappeared in Metroid Fusion on the space station where the X-parasite is running rampant. These guys were in their own little habitats, completely isolated from the rest of the space station, and Samus frees them and they run off to a gunship. At the time, people would like to speculate that maybe on their way over they ended up getting infected by the X-parasite because they spread so quickly throughout the rest of the space station. But Metroid Dread has already deconfirmed this theory as false, but before that game came out, that didn't stop this theory from spreading, and the widest exposure it got was when MatPack covered it in a Game Theory episode.
Okay, so I'm recording this after editing everything together. It's been a while since I watched that Game Theory episode, so I just rewatched it now just to make sure I wasn't talking out of my ass. Now, look, I have been a subscriber to the Game Theorists for years now. Like, I'm Mario as a communist years old. I remember when MatPat used to make theories about video game titties, okay? That's how far back me and that channel go. And I have nothing but respect for Matthew Patrick, because I think the man gets dogged on for too many things, and 95% of the time, it's completely undeserved. You can say what you want about him and his content, but I do genuinely believe he makes good work. And furthermore, you can't find anything bad about this man. Like, you know how so many other internet personalities, you can dig up some shit they did like 10 years ago, and it's like really horrifying, but no, you can't find anything on Matt. He's like one of the purest internet personalities out there. So understand that what I'm about to say comes from a place of nothing but reverence for Matt and the game theorists. But the Animals Must Die theory is the quintessential terrible game theory episode. Like, Matt's arms must be jacked for how much reaching he has to do in theories like this. He's leaping to conclusions without providing any kind of evidence to back up these claims, misconstruing like specific details, like the fact that it was Samus's infected power suit that the space station got infected in the first place, not the presence of the animals. What evidence he does provide is incidental at best, and the direct evidence he does supply doesn't actually contribute towards his main point. All of this is used to really ham-fist in a narrative that I'm pretty convinced he created just for clickbait. And the more I say this out loud, the more this sounds like a conspiracy theory, honestly. Like, this is how stuff like QAnon gets made in the first place, just stringing together details that don't actually matter, but just contriving a convincing enough story or through line through all of it. And what's most damning of all, just like a batshit crazy conspiracy theory, is the fact that he completely avoids the one piece of evidence that discredits the entire thing. And that's that it's confirmed in the game itself that the animals are not infected. When they board Samus's gunship, Adam does a scan on them, and it says right there that they're not infected. The entire theory is just completely shot out of the water in 5 seconds. And I feel like it was deliberately left out because otherwise it wouldn't be a theory. Now, don't twist my words. I'm not here claiming that MatPat is a conspiracy theorist. I'm just pointing out how terrible theories in general, gaming or otherwise, this is how they're constructed. And obviously this isn't all of MatPat's theories. There are some much better ones and ones that have a lot more thought put into them. But I just can't escape the irony that people want to point at these specific theories and use them as leverage to denounce Matt as a person. But so many other people, and I have this strange feeling that the exact same audience that criticizes him, they are so willing to jump on the fucking draconian alien theory and start spouting that up as if it's the truth when they're constructed just as poorly as game theories like this. Now, I'm sure MatPat isn't the originator of this theory. Something that a lot of people tend to forget is that he doesn't actually come up with most of these theories. He just plucks them from the fan bases who have been touting around these theories for years, like the Link is dead theory and that Nursejoy is a Pokemon. So I don't think he was the originator, but the fact that that video has 4 million views, I think definitely propagated that theory beyond the fan base and brought a lot of mainstream attention. And furthermore, this theory got even more popular with its inclusion in terminal montages, something about Super Metroid video. Although it doesn't really make sense in that video because the X-Parasites are native to SR388, not Zebes, which is where Super Metroid takes place on. And
God, I'm such a fucking nerd. How is it that I remember all this shit, but I can't remember my wife's birthday? Power bombs are nukes. This is basically just pointing out how the power bomb upgrade is just absurdly powerful, just able to screen clear absolutely everything. A lot of people like to joke around how Samus has basically dropped miniature nuclear bombs. Although I don't think that's literally what they are, because for one, but first of all, they be leaving a giant ass crater everywhere they're placed, and the environments are still completely intact. And furthermore, they'd also be leaving a lot of radiation, meaning that enemies won't be coming back and all the planet will be dead. And that's also not happening because enemies just constantly respawn once you enter an exit room, suggesting that the environment isn't tainted that much. You would feel radiation, trust me on that.
Now, admittedly, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but I do watch a lot of Kyle Hill's videos, so that's basically the equivalent of a PhD education, right?
There is one enemy that can beat out the power bomb. It's these black space pirates in Metroid Zero Mission and the golden space pirates in Super Metroid. These things are completely invulnerable to the power bombs, forcing you to use your regular beam weaponry. Phazon is Metroid crap. The corruptive substance that is called Phazon, that's more or less the main antagonist of the Metroid Prime games. Some people like to postulate that these are actually droppings from Metroids because they're too often seen hand in hand with each other. Now, if I'm remembering all the logbooks correctly, and there's a lot of them, and it's been a while, and haven't been able to comb over every single one of them to get this video out in time, but from what I can tell, this is not the case. For one, Phazon is a product of the planet Phase, which is this giant planet that's just nothing but Phazon, and it discharges out these seeds, which
infect other planets and infects it with Phazon. That's just how it reproduces. That is the confirmed source of Phazon itself. Metroids do seem to have like a really weird connection with Phazon that creates a lot of confusing questions about the lore. For example, Metroids are native to Phase. So in Metroid Prime 3, once you visit the aforementioned home planet of Phazon, aptly named Phase, you will find a whole bunch of Phazon-infected Metroids, and it's kind of confusing as to how these things got there in the first place, because as mentioned before, the Metroids were artificial beings created on SR388 by the Chozo. So what the hell are they doing here? So here's the thing. Dark Samus, who's another recurring antagonist in Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Prime 3, that is actually the Metroid Prime itself, because at the end of Metroid Prime, Samus is forced to discard her Phazon suit right after she killed the Metroid Prime. But from the brink of death, the Prime was able to inhabit this suit and it's kept itself alive, and ever since it's assumed the form of Dark Samus and has been hunting her down through the next 2 games. And remember that the Metroid Prime was able to spawn other Metroids in its lair at the center of the impact crater in the first game. So it's not too far-fetched to assume that these Metroids on Phase are actually coming from Dark Samus herself. That's my guess though, because otherwise, like, what the fuck is going on here? Gore's original race. The bounty hunter Gore, who appeared in Metroid Prime 3, looks like he's just a sentient robot type race, which do exist in the Metroid universe, as evidenced by the robots in Skytown. But he's not actually a robot, he's actually a cyborg. His body's just been through so much that he pretty much replaced almost the entirety of his body with cybernetics. Kind of like what Samus's original backstory was supposed to be. The thing is, Gore's original species was never stated. In fact, nobody knows what it is. It's not listed anywhere, not in the logbooks, not in any like official media, like nowhere. We don't even know what he used to look like. And some people like to theorize like he was a space pirate or one of the other already established like alien races, but I don't think he was any race we've seen yet, because Metroid's universe just seems to be that vast. There's just so many different alien races that I don't think we're ever going to know what he used to be. I gotta say though, his backstory kind of reminds me of Mighty Gazelle from F-Zero. Gandreda is the last of her kind. This is another character that appeared in Metroid Prime 3. Gandreda's species is listed as unknown, and all that's known about it is that they're shapeshifters. And because this is the only time we've ever seen this species or this ability, some players think that Gandreda is actually the last of her species. And as mentioned earlier, I don't think this is the case just because Metroid's universe is just so wide and vast. We just haven't seen this yet in the games. I'm sure there's plenty of other these creatures out there, but by the fact that they're shapeshifters, we just don't realize it. And furthermore, we've only seen the galaxy from Samus's perspective. There's so much of the world that we're missing. I'm sure there's even more alien races that we haven't seen yet. Hell, most of the races that we've seen in the manga never even made appearances in any of the games. Gandreda is Goria. So the main antagonist of Metroid Prime Hunters is this being called Goria, who is basically this ancient planet-destroying entity that used to be worshipped as a god. One of the biggest things that the logbooks reveal about Goria was that it was a shapeshifter. So I think a lot of people connected the dots and assumed that whatever this thing was, it was the same species, or at least very similar to Gandreda. No way to confirm this. I think just the fact that they're both shapeshifters does create a connection, but I don't know. Metroid Prime Hunters and Metroid Prime 3 were made by 2 different teams, so I don't think they're really communicating with each other, so maybe it was just like an accident. Who knows, because we don't know for sure what shapeshifting species even looks like. For all we know, the way that Gandreda appears isn't even actually her biologically true form. It's just like the form that she personally finds most fitting of her. So these things could look like absolutely anything, so who's to say that Goria isn't in fact the same species? Weevil was in Zero Mission. Weevil was one of the bounty hunters introduced in Metroid Prime Hunters. His whole background was that he actually ran into Samus a long time ago, and of course he lost because that's just what Samus does to space pirates. But he survived the encounter and had to get his body all roboticized in order to keep him alive.
A lot of fans like to speculate that we've actually seen him before in the prior games, and we may have even seen the moment where Samus almost killed him. At the very end of Zero Mission, Samus has to escape the space pirate ship that she snuck up into, which was now self-destructing because it wouldn't be the climax of a Metroid game if something wasn't exploding. She hops into one of their crafts and speeds out, and as she's trying to zoom out of the hangar, this one ballsy space pirate tries to hop on the craft, either out of desperation or just whatever, and she runs him over as she's flying out. And a lot of people like to speculate that this was actually Weevil. I don't think this was, because again, we straight up see that poor bastard just blow up into a whole bunch of chunky pieces, and even if he were to survive that, the entire ship exploded so large that you could see it from space. There is no way like a critically injured space pirate would have survived that. I feel like Weevil's backstory was just one of those things that we saw off camera. Samus was just off on so many adventures that we don't always get to see in the games, and whatever like encounter she had with Weevil, like we just never saw it. However, I will say, if we are still going to stress like the idea that we saw Weevil before, or he was at the very least in one of the previous games, I think it's more likely that he was one of the black space pirates, because again, those motherfuckers are tough. If they were able to shrug off power bombs if they're nothing, I think that they could possibly survive a giant explosion like that. Sylux is a woman. Sylux's backstory is kept intentionally very vague. The only thing we're known about them for sure is that they've always had a grudge against the Federation, and that's about it. So this has left a lot of room for interpretation, so people like to guess up and down what their identity could possibly be, whether or not like they're a woman, whether they have like a connection to Samus somehow, this or that. Yeah, you can guess about anything with this character, and the truth is, I don't think we're ever going to get anything concrete until Metroid Prime 4 eventually hits. I will say though, her being a woman would be a fun throwback to how it was originally a big deal that Samus was revealed to be a woman in the original Metroid. In fact, I could see a situation where the writers create Sylux as like a dark parallel to Samus's character. Like, they don't have Dark Samus anymore, so they have to give her a whole different rival, one who had possibly a similar backstory but end up going on an entirely different path. I think that could be fun. Solomon Aran. So, the big reason why we still know about Blood of the Chozo even being a thing to begin with was that Nintendo Power themselves wrote an article about the current developments of the story at that time in one of their issues. They had a highlight reel of like some of the major plot developments and some of the major characters that the fans had created, and one of them was Solomon Aran, who was basically the long lost brother of Samus. Now, of course, this is completely non-canon. It's been like confirmed time and time again that Samus was an only child by the time the K2L incident happened. However, I wouldn't be opposed to the idea that there was actually another survivor of the K2L attack, one that wasn't related by Samus, but they could serve as like as I was saying earlier, what if like this other mysterious survivor was actually Sylux? Again, it would reinforce the idea that the two had like the same starting point but ended up on far different paths. Impact Crater and Sky Temple are Leviathans. The Leviathans are like giant Phazon seeds that Phase shoots out into space to infect other planets with Phazon. So in Metroid Prime 1, the exact origin of Phazon is never really explicitly told, but through the sequels, and especially through Metroid Prime 3, it is heavily implied that the Impact Crater, the point where a mysterious meteoroid fell on the planet and started poisoning the land with Phazon, was in fact a Leviathan seed. And in Metroid Prime 2, for a quick recap, the whole gimmick of Metroid Prime 2 is that there's two versions of the planet. There's a light version and a dark version. And this split occurred when a mysterious meteor impacted the planet and somehow created a whole alternate dimension. Just go with it. If you go inside the Sky Temple, the final area of the game, going inside the Sky Temple, the fact that there's a lot of Phazon inside the temple itself seems to suggest that the temple itself is the Leviathan. Perhaps when it impacted, it somehow ended up in a parallel dimension, and that's what has been creating Dark Aether and the Ing, which seem to worship Phase as some sort of god. This connection would explain why Dark Samus is so intent on trying to stop Samus's quest to remove Dark Aether from the planet. Portal is fusion. A lot of people notice how there's some interesting parallels to the Portal games and Metroid Fusion's plot. They both star a silent but strong female character who start their quest waking up from a bed. They have to spend most of the game taking orders from a computer, end up disobeying the orders of said computer, and trying to escape the facility that's falling apart around them. These are all surface level comparisons, and I think just a weird coincidence. I wanted to include this point to show how there's a lot of theories going around about how Metroid Fusion is a simulation somehow, like none of it is actually real, or it's some kind of like test. Samus was still in the coma after like her ship ejected. Yada. I'm not a fan of any of these theories. Like, I know I was praising it earlier with Metroid Other M, but Metroid Fusion is a great game. We don't need to get rid of it. Like, what's wrong with y'all? Samus is dead in Super Metroid. This was another theory that Super Red Plays put on the iceberg, and the man is like half the reason why we're all here anyways, so I figured I'd do him a favor and cover his theory real quick. So here's how it goes. Samus actually died during the escape sequence at the very beginning of the game, and everything she experiences afterwards is actually taking place in Purgatory. Zebes is actually what she misremembered based on the events of the first game. Kraid, Dracomire, and Crocomire and Phantoon, they all represent demons, and when she's going into Norfair, she's actually going into hell, and when she's fighting Ridley, she's actually fighting the devil himself. And Mother Brain is actually the angel of death. The baby Metroid is actually a guardian angel that comes and rescues her at the last minute. And when she's able to escape, she's ascending back up through all of the chambers, and it's supposed to represent her ascending into heaven, because now she's conquered her demons and all. It's a silly theory, and it's full of holes, and this is by Red's own admissions, not my own, but he's still super proud of it. And I will say, it's not completely unfounded. I mean, Norfair does look more hellish in Super Metroid than it does in any other game. And furthermore, if the game had kept the red Crateria color palette, it kind of would continue that hellish motif, you know? Phantoon's body exists in another dimension. So Phantoon is kind of like a weird boss to have in a science fiction game, because he's basically, for all intents and purposes, a ghost haunting a ghost ship. It's just like super odd to have like something supernatural and was otherwise like a very straight played science fiction adventure. So a lot of people theorize that Phantoon isn't actually a ghost, he's some kind of being that's just able to change his body from like one dimension to the other, and that his physical being doesn't actually exist in our current plane of existence. I will say though, it does seem weird at first to have like ghosts in the Metroid universe, but ghosts aren't entirely out of the question in this world. I mean, you fight Chozo ghosts, and the Chozo themselves seem to imply to have a lot of spiritual knowledge and spiritual technology, so I think having like supernatural elements in this world isn't entirely out of the question. Speaking of Phantoon, Phantoon is a mother brain. A lot of fans have pointed out how there seems to be a lot of similarities between Phantoon and Mother Brain, in the fact that they both seem to have like a very brain-like shape and a one single eye. To further increase the connections, even if we don't know where the wrecked ship is or where it came from, the Aurora units are basically Mother Brains in and of themselves, and Aurora units, according to Metroid Prime 3, are often put along ships to help run space travel and diagnostics and all that stuff. So what if Phantoon was actually an Aurora unit that was either made by the space pirates, or was their attempt to like make an Aurora unit of their own and place it on one of their own ships, but that ship crashed, and now this like half-built Aurora unit basically haunts the ship now. Chozo statues are partly organic. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Chozo statues aren't actually statues, but a piece of biological technology created by the Chozo. In Super Metroid, there's a Chozo statue that seems to have all these weeds and stuff growing out of it. As you like blow pieces of it, it shows fleshy interior underneath it. And in Metroid Fusion, you actually find a Chozo statue that turns out to be an X-parasite mimicking its appearance, which it shouldn't be doing if the Chozo statue was an entirely stone and not actually a living creature.
The fact that the Chozo were able to genetically engineer creatures like the Metroids show that they do have a proficiency in bioengineering, so I don't think it's entirely out of the question. And maybe it's this biotechnology that the Slashers are able to interface with Samus's power suit, which seems to be a product that's both biological and energy based, so I think this all enforces this idea that the Chozo statues are, in one sense, partially alive. The power suit is shaped after a Chozo, so it's basically confirmed in canon that the power suit was originally created to be used by Chozo soldiers, not by humans. It's actually revealed that the power suit had to be modified to be compatible with Samus specifically. The power suit is energy based. This was a theory originally proposed by Loxton Noggin, in which he suggests that the power suit isn't exactly a physical piece of technology, but rather an energy piece of technology. As stated earlier, the Chozo were a very spiritual race, so it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to suggest that they had like supernatural elements to the technology. The fact that Samus's power suit seems to like materialize out of anywhere, the fact that it's able to like shapeshift itself with the morph ball, and the fact that its ability to function has to be directly tied to Samus's mental state. I mean, hell, when she straight up dies, the suit disappears with her. All of this is to suggest that the power suit is somehow an energy-based piece of technology that's directly tied to Samus's spiritual force. Adding to this theory, I made like a whole other separate video. It's the same one that's talking about Samus's age, but I basically posited that if the power suit is energy based, then that must mean the power-ups are actually batteries of some type, and this would explain why Samus is constantly losing her abilities at the beginning of every game. Or it also explains like the reasons why she ends up losing them in like increasingly convoluted manners. So check that one out after you're done with the Iceberg video if that interests you, if you haven't already. The Galactic Federation is authoritarian. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence sprinkled throughout the series that suggests that the Galactic Federation is more like a Sith Empire than the Federation from Star Trek. For one, the Metroid manga actually depicts it in a very questionable light. They basically use the space pirates as a manufactured crisis to like encourage the various galactic races to become more militarized, feeding into people's fear and paranoia about the space pirates attacks to like bolster their military force. And this has greatly disappointed Chozo because the entire point of the Galactic Federation was to be peacekeepers, not war makers. And this mirrors very much like how actual totalitarian societies have risen throughout history. They feed off of people's fear and paranoia to like increase their military strength and xenophobic nationalism, to try and like fight off anyone that surrounds them, and that bolsters them to keep fighting and conquesting under the name of like preventing their country from like certain doom or something. Furthermore, we see this ripple throughout the series. For example, in Metroid Prime 3, we basically see the full extent of how militarized the Galactic Federation really is. They have entire fleets of warships at their command. And finally, in Metroid Fusion, it seems like they are just as focused on making the Metroids into bioweapons as the space pirates are, as they try to like manufacture them in secret behind Samus's back. And Adam gets mad at her when she suggests that, no, we need to blow this up and destroy everything, because apparently it's not the agenda. In fact, when they realize that Samus has gotten too close to the project, they want her off of the mission immediately. They try to even lock her up in the room to prevent her from escaping and stopping them. Why would a peacekeeping society be so focused on weapon development? They wouldn't be unless they're actively trying to find wars to fight in.
Okay, this is another point that I completely forgot to include when I was initially recording, but in the manga, the Galactic Federation were straight up willing to let the Chozo die. When they got word that Zebes had been conquered by the space pirates, they were ready to straight up nuke the planet from orbit from their ships instead of actually saving them, because they were more concerned about all the knowledge and technology of the Chozo falling into the space pirates' hands. Now, thankfully, Samus was able to swoop in and rescue the Chozo, so they didn't have to resort to that. But what you got is a government entity that was put in power due to the help of the Chozo, But as soon as the Chosen were no longer like helpful to them, and when in fact they went against their agenda, because again the Chosen were peacekeepers, not warmongers like the Galactic Federation had become now, they were so quick to like drop them and straight up sacrifice them so they would no longer be in their way. This is not the behavior of a benevolent government entity. I think it's heavily implied that this is why Samus left the Galactic Federation. Also, the manga points out how the Galactic Federation is responsible for a lot of war crimes of their own, and are also systemically racist, as they only allow the most powerful or most acceptable species at the topmost ranks that make all the decisions and let everybody else like squander. But you know what? This is why I love the manga so much. It adds all these little seeds and snippets that imply that there's a much bigger universe with a lot more going on than we ever get to see in the games. The power suit is a Metroid. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that ever since Metroid Fusion, Samus is technically a Metroid herself because she was infused with its DNA to save herself from the X-Parasite. No, I'm talking about from the very beginning, the power suit itself is a Metroid. Or at the very least, it's made from the same technology that created the Metroids. Because as we discussed earlier, the power suit appears to be a product of biological technology as much as it is conventional technology, as it's tied to Samus's very being. And furthermore, notice how every time you kill an enemy in the games, they always drop these power-ups. Nothing is ever really explained about what these things are, even in the logbooks of the Prime games. You don't explain like why these creatures drop these things or what their in-universe purpose is. All they do is that they restore Samus's energy and they provide her ammo for more powerful items. Kinda like a Metroid, which uses the life energy of other creatures to both nourish itself and to make itself stronger so it can go into its other evolutionary forms. And just like Metroids, these power-ups only drop when you kill other creatures. This the exact same way that Metroids have to feed off of other creatures in order to survive. To take this even further, in Samus Returns, enemies drop a new type of power called Aether Energy. It's never explained what Aether is in the Metroid universe, but Aether itself is a very old word that comes from Greek, and it roughly translates to life energy, which means in a very literal sense, Samus is draining the life out of these creatures. If this were to be true, it would have huge implications for the entire series and for the story as a whole. It kind of paints a narrative that mirrors a lot of great science fiction, in which the story is about how great technology brings a lot of prosperity, because the Metroids were originally created to bring peace to the universe, but at the same time, technology also creates whole new problems, as the entire conflict of the franchise is surrounding all the problems that the Metroids have now created. And yet, it is also a Metroid itself that is the solution to these very problems. This is a theme that is especially prevalent in a lot of Japanese science fiction, as they directly suffered underneath the catastrophic consequences of scientific advancements. And this also adds a lot of weight to Samus's own story as well. The Chozo has spent their entire existence trying to improve the galaxy in the creation of the Galactic Federation and the creation of the Metroids, but it seems like every turn they take, it only creates even more complications for the universe. And Samus Aran, the last child of the Chozo, is forever doomed to clean up after their messes, because she is also a product of the Chozo. Samus is a Metroid, which means the entire Metroid race are paradoxically hunters as well as the hunted.
It's done. It's finally done. Holy shit, I am never making anything this fucking long ever again. Unless people pay me. And when I say pay me, I mean donating to my Patreon or buying me a coffee. Or just dropping a giant sack of cash in my PayPal or PO box or some shit. I don't know. When I originally released these videos last year, I ended it by saying that I was going to give this whole YouTube thing 1 year and see how it turned out. And if you look at my upload schedule, then you'll see that didn't really pan out at all. Yeah, making YouTube videos is so much harder than I think people ever truly realize. So much more time and effort is involved into making good videos. It's to the point where if you want to maintain a regular upload schedule, you would have to make YouTube a full-time job. That's why so many of the popular channels, or I'm sure a majority of the channels that you watch that do maintain a regular upload schedule, that is their job. That's all they do day in and day out, because that's what's required of them. And to be honest, I can't do that. This is going to sound so douchey to say, but I have too much of a life. I have a full-time job that has to get the bills paid. I have to juggle trying to figure out how to be a first-time dad, and I have my writing and comic projects, which are my actual passion. Those are the things that I really want to actually take off. If I'm going to be honest, I started making YouTube videos purely as a way to promote my art career more than anything else. These videos would basically serve as advertisements for whatever comics or books I'd be releasing. But to be honest, trying to get people to notice YouTube videos is just as hard as trying to get people to notice my comics, and I've been struggling on that front to begin with, so this is a very long and rambling way of saying that this channel isn't going to get a lot of activity on it. It's probably going to be a couple months, if not a whole year, before I upload something else, and that's going to entirely depend on whether or not I can find a format that's going to allow me to pump stuff out quickly. And I hope that's not a huge disappointment to the small handful of you who did subscribe, but I just want to be honest with y'all. YouTube is not friendly at all to new channels. In fact, it does everything in its power to discourage you and try to sabotage your success, actually. So if you guys are interested in seeing more video content from me, then you're going to have to hit the buttons down below. Like, I know you hear all the time from other YouTubers, like, smash the subscribe button, be sure to hit that like, and I know, I hear it all the time too, and it annoys me just as much as I'm sure it annoys you. But for smaller channels especially, the like and subscribe button really are the only useful metrics to help tell us that there's people out there who actually do care for our stuff. It's the only metric that's useful, and it's not going to destroy our ego, honestly. Running a channel is going to be a lot of work, so I need to know early on if it's even going to be worth it. If there is some of you who would like to see more stuff from me, this channel would mostly be covering games and genres that don't get a lot of attention, and I'd like to give them a spotlight. We'd be covering mech games like Armored Core and Virtual On, talk about a whole different slew of futuristic races and F-Zero clones, or even individual games that have been forgotten by time, like Custom Robo. I really want to do a Custom Robo video. That's one of the things I really want to work on next as a video project. And as for Metroid stuff, I'm not going to touch Metroid stuff in a while, because I just need a break from the franchise after having to make these goddamn videos twice now. But when I do have an idea of a video in which I play every single 2D Metroid game in chronological order, as opposed to release order, because I actually did do that leading up to the release of Metroid Dread, and it was an interesting experience, and I have a lot to say about it, especially about certain entries. If any of those things sound interesting at all to you, then you know which buttons to press, literally. And other than that, my website is going to be stuff that is going to have more regularly uploaded content, because that's where all my comics and all my priority projects are going to go up there, including Mighty Machine, including Garage Mechs, which I've already told you about in the ad break, so look forward to all that stuff. But yeah, that's about everything. So if you made it this long in this massive love letter to the Metroid franchise. Let me know by leaving a horse emoji in your comment somewhere. I don't know, just a horse emoji. I don't know why. I need to get some sleep. Thank you so much, guys, and I'm hoping I'll see some of you again down the road later.